The morning Nora Whitfield found the foreclosure notice taped to her front door, she was still wearing the clothes she'd slept in. She'd slept in them because she hadn't meant to sleep at all. She'd sat on the kitchen floor the night before with her back against the cabinet under the sink, the one that always leaked a little, and held her phone in both hands, scrolling through her bank app, like scrolling a second time would change the numbers. It didn't. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The joint account she and Daniel had shared for 11 years showed a balance of $43.17. The savings account she'd trusted him to manage, the one they'd built slowly, painfully, through years of picking up extra shifts and skipping vacations and telling the kids they couldn't do summer camp this year. Maybe next year. That account showed zero. Not low. Not nearly empty. Zero. Closed. The timestamp on the transaction read 2 days prior, a Thursday morning, while Nora had been at the elementary school where she worked as a classroom aide, helping 6-year-olds sound out words they didn't yet trust themselves to read. Her husband had waited until she left for work. Then he'd cleaned them out and gone. No note. No call. His phone went straight to voicemail. His car was gone from the driveway. His half of the closet was emptied with a precision that told her this wasn't impulsive. He'd packed carefully, quietly, over time. He'd planned this the way you plan a trip you've been looking forward to. She sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. Long enough that the light through the window changed. Long enough that her back ached from the cabinet handle pressing into her shoulder. Long enough that the fear moved through shock and rage and landed somewhere colder and harder, the place where you stop feeling and start calculating. Because calculating is the only thing left. She had 2 kids asleep upstairs. Maya was 9. Caleb was 6. They didn't know yet. They were dreaming whatever children dream. Safe in their beds in a house that was 3 months behind on the mortgage because Daniel had said he was handling it. Had always said he was handling it. And she had believed him because you believe the person you've built your life beside. $43.17. The foreclosure notice on the door the next morning was for the house. 3 months past due. The bank had sent letters. Nora found those letters later in a shoebox in the back of Daniel's old closet shelf, still sealed in their envelopes, arranged by date. He'd intercepted them. He'd made sure she wouldn't see them. He'd been managing that, too. Her name was Nora Whitfield, and she was 41 years old, and the house she'd raised her children in was being taken by the bank and the man who'd promised to love her until he didn't had left without saying goodbye. And somewhere in the back of her mind, just starting to surface through everything else, was a memory of a conversation she'd barely paid attention to 3 years ago. A notarized document that arrived in the mail from a county she'd never visited. A property Daniel had almost dismissed in front of her, laughing a little. A beekeeper's shed in Carroll County, Tennessee, worth maybe $2,000 at best, he'd said. Worthless, he'd said. Don't bother. It's in your name, though, she'd said, and he'd shrugged and said they'd sell it eventually, and she'd signed the acknowledgement form and forgotten about it. He'd left that one behind. She was sure of it now, sitting on the kitchen floor. He'd taken everything that could be liquidated in a hurry. He'd left the thing that looked like nothing. It would take her 6 weeks to understand that he had made the only mistake that mattered. She didn't tell Maya and Caleb that first morning. She made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and she watched them eat with the focused attention of someone memorizing something. The way Maya held her fork slightly crooked. The way Caleb talked with his mouth full even though they'd told him not to for years. She told them Daddy was away for work. Maya looked at her for a long second with eyes that were too old for 9. She didn't push. Caleb asked if he could have more juice. The weeks that followed were the kind that don't make sense when you try to describe them later. The foreclosure gave her 90 days to vacate. She called a legal aid office and waited 3 weeks for a callback. She went through every document she could find in the house, trying to understand the full shape of what Daniel had done, and the shape was worse than she'd expected. Credit cards opened in both their names, maxed out. A home equity line he'd drawn down without her knowledge. A second car loan. A personal loan from an online lender at 22% interest. The debt was a precise architecture of someone who'd been building an exit strategy for at least 2 years. She told her mother on a Tuesday night after the kids were in bed. Her mother was quiet on the phone for a long time, then said she could send $300, which was everything her mother had in savings. And Nora said, "Please don't. I'll figure it out." and cried alone in the bathroom with the fan on so the kids wouldn't hear. She found the property document in a folder in the filing cabinet Daniel had left behind because it was bolted to the wall and too heavy to bother with. The deed was in her name only. The land was listed as 3 acres in Carroll County, Tennessee. The structure was described simply as one outbuilding, approximately 400 square feet, current condition unknown. It had come to them through a great-uncle of Nora's who died without direct heirs. The estate had been modest. A pickup truck, some tools, the land, and the shed. She called the county assessor's office and asked about current value. The woman on the phone looked it up and said the assessed value was $1,900. $2,000 on a good day, she added, as if that helped. Nora thanked her and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with the deed in front of her and did the math she'd been avoiding. The 90 days from the foreclosure notice would run out in early March. She had $43 when this started and had managed, through careful rationing and a second job picking up shifts at a grocery store 3 evenings a week, to hold that number just above zero. She was not going to catch up on the mortgage. She was not going to save the house. That calculation was finished. She needed somewhere to go. She needed something. She booked 2 nights in the cheapest motel she could find near Carroll County for $112. She put on the one credit card that still had a thin margin. She told the kids they were taking a little trip, something different, maybe an adventure. Maya looked at the boxes that had started appearing in the living room and didn't say anything. Caleb asked if there would be a pool. They drove down on a Friday. Nora's car was a 2013 Hyundai with 214,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on so long she'd stopped seeing it. The drive from their home in Kentucky to Carroll County was 3 hours through flat land that opened into rolling hills in the final stretch, bare trees and gray sky, the kind of November landscape that looks like the world has decided to take everything back. She had the address in her phone's GPS. The road it directed her down narrowed after the second mile, gravel replacing asphalt, the edges softened by overgrown grass. She drove slowly. Maya had her face against the window. Caleb was asleep in his booster seat with his mouth slightly open. The property appeared around a bend as a cleared space set back from the road, framed by old oak trees with branches spread wide and empty. The land was mostly open, the grass gone brown and tall, with a small stand of cedar trees along the back boundary. And in the middle of it, set on a low concrete pad with a tin roof that caught the weak November sun, sat the shed. It was not impressive. She'd known it wouldn't be. But seeing it in person felt different from reading a county assessment. The walls were old wood, the kind that had grayed out over decades until it was closer to silver than brown. The door was padlocked. 2 small windows on the near side had gone cloudy with age and dirt. Around the base of the structure, years of blown leaves had banked up like a tide line. She got out of the car. The cold hit her, clean and sharp. She walked across the overgrown grass slowly, the way you walk when you're not sure what you're walking toward. Maya climbed out behind her without being asked, and they stood together in front of the shed in the gray light. "It's kind of pretty," Maya said, in an old way. Nora looked at her daughter. She looked at the shed. She thought about the debt that was following her like weather. She thought about the credit card in her wallet with just enough margin for 2 nights in a motel and a tank of gas home. There was a locksmith in the nearest town, 9 miles back. She'd looked it up before driving down, the way she'd started doing everything lately, looking things up before she needed them because being unprepared had cost her everything. She drove back and got him, a man named Earl who was in his 60s and drove a truck with a hand-painted magnetic sign on the door. He followed her back to the property and opened the padlock in 4 minutes and charged her $45, and she paid it with the card and didn't wince, and they walked in together. The shed smelled like cedar and something else, something older, something she didn't have a word for immediately. Beeswax. That was it. The whole structure had been saturated with it over years of use. Wooden shelving ran along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, most of it empty. But what wasn't empty stopped her. Row after row of honey jars. Hundreds of them. Old ones, dust-covered, labels handwritten in faded ink. But also equipment she recognized from pictures, if not from life. Frames, supers, a smoker, an extractor, veils and gloves carefully folded on a high shelf. A hand-painted ledger hanging on a hook beside the door. Everything organized with the discipline of someone who had built something here over a long time and cared about the details. The great-uncle's name had been William Ryder. She'd never met him. He'd been the kind of relative that existed in family stories more than in actual visits. He kept bees. He lived alone. He was strange, her mother had said once, but kind. That was the whole of what she knew. Earl looked around with the expression of a man who'd seen everything and had mostly stopped being surprised by any of it. He pointed at the ledger on the wall. You might want to read that. She unhooked it carefully. The pages inside were dense with small, careful handwriting. Dates going back 40 years. Colony counts, harvest weights, notes in the margins about weather and bloom times, and the particular behavior of individual hives that had been cataloged by number like old friends. She didn't read it all that day. She photographed every page with her phone, standing in the cold of the shed with her breath coming out in small clouds. And she didn't know yet what she was looking at. She only knew that William Ryder had kept bees in this place for most of his adult life, and that he had recorded everything, and that something in the way he'd written these pages made her feel the weight of all that attention, all those years, all that care. She didn't know yet what it was worth. She drove back to the motel with Maya and Caleb and ordered pizza with the last of her card margin and let Caleb watch cartoons with the volume too high while she sat at the little desk in the corner and read through every photograph she'd taken of the ledger pages. Maya fell asleep early. Caleb lasted until the second episode of whatever was on. Nora read until 1 in the morning. William Ryder had not kept a small hobbyist operation. He had run, at his peak, 112 colonies across 3 properties in Carroll County, properties he'd owned outright, properties she'd found no record of in the estate documents. The ledger referenced them by name. The Hollow site, the Ridge site, the Far Apiary. He'd sold honey wholesale, sold beeswax to candle makers and cosmetic companies, sold queen bees and nucleus colonies to other beekeepers across 3 states. The ledger listed buyers with names and phone numbers that were 20 and 30 years old. But it was the last section of the ledger that made her stop breathing for a moment. William had written it in different ink, bluer, more recent, from what she could tell. And his handwriting in this section was different, smaller, less certain, the handwriting of someone older than the man who'd written the earlier pages. He'd written about something he called the reserve stock. He'd written about it carefully and a little obliquely, the way people sometimes write about things they don't want anyone to find too easily, but also can't quite bring themselves not to document. He'd been keeping, he wrote, a portion of each year's exceptional harvest. The jars he didn't sell, the jars that were different. He'd been keeping them here, in the shed, in a specific place he described only as below the cedar boards, and he'd been doing it since 1987. 35 years of reserve stock. She didn't understand yet. Not fully. She thought maybe he'd been saving his best honey, and she'd find 100 jars of old honey below the floorboards of the shed, which would be interesting but not life-changing. She drove back to the property the next morning while Caleb and Maya were still asleep and the motel breakfast room was still out. The key Earl had left her worked on the new padlock he'd installed. She went inside alone, into the cedar and beeswax smell of the place, and she found the cedar boards. They were set into the floor along the back wall, flush with the concrete pad, easy to miss if you weren't looking. 3 boards, joined in a way that looked structural but wasn't. She found the seam with her fingernails and then with a flathead screwdriver from a toolkit William had left on the bottom shelf, and she lifted the first board. Beneath it was a space. Concrete walls, maybe 4 feet deep, maybe 6 feet long, covered with a sheet of heavy plastic sheeting that had been carefully taped at the edges to keep out moisture. She pulled back the plastic. Jars. But not honey jars. Or not only honey jars. There were honey jars. Dozens of them, sealed in wax, labeled in William's handwriting, dated. Some of them were from the 1990s. Some from the early 2000s. A few with dates from just 2 years ago. Old honey, kept in darkness and stable temperature for decades. But among the honey jars, wrapped separately in cloth and nested in wooden frames that William had built himself, were other things. She lifted the first wrapped bundle carefully, unwound the cloth, found a small bottle, brown glass, sealed with a cork and dipped in wax to make it airtight. Inside the bottle was a liquid the color of old amber. She found a label tied around the neck with twine. The label was in William's handwriting and it said, simply, Tupelo, 1989, Apalachicola, and below that a number. 4 pounds 2 ounces. She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. She lifted another bundle. Another bottle. Sorghum, 1994, Private Grove, Tennessee Ridge. Another number. She counted the bundles in that first space before going back for the kids. There were 47 of them. She photographed everything, sat back on her heels in the cold shed, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly. Something more careful than hope. A question that she didn't have the answer to yet, but that felt important enough to ask. She drove back to the motel and woke the kids and told them they were going to spend one more day here. The search she did that afternoon on her phone, sitting on the bed while the kids played cards on the floor, was the kind of search that starts broad and gets specific fast when what you're finding keeps surprising you. She typed in Tupelo honey value. She typed in rare honey prices. She typed in antique honey auction. She typed in Apalachicola Tupelo honey 1989. The numbers that came back were not what she was expecting. Tupelo honey from the white Tupelo tree, harvested in the Apalachicola River Basin in Florida, was one of the rarest and most sought-after honeys in the world. The white Tupelo bloom lasted only 2 to 3 weeks a year. The conditions for a good harvest were specific and unpredictable. Authentic Tupelo honey from verified sources commanded prices that bore no relationship to grocery store honey. She found auction records. She found specialty food sites. She found a collector's forum where people discussed single jars of authenticated pre-2000 Tupelo honey with the reverence that wine people reserve for Grand Cru vintages. A 4-pound jar of authenticated 1989 Apalachicola Tupelo honey, in original sealed condition. She had to look up the record 3 times before she believed what she was reading. She put her phone face down on the bedspread and looked at the ceiling. Maya looked up from her cards. Mom. Nora looked at her daughter. Maya's face was careful the way it had been for weeks now, watchful, trying to read her mother the way children read weather. I think, Nora said slowly, I think maybe your great-great-uncle William was keeping something for us. Maya's expression didn't change immediately. She was 9 and careful and didn't let herself believe things too quickly. She'd learned that recently. What kind of something? She asked. Nora sat up on the bed and pulled her daughter close and said, I don't know the full shape of it yet, but I think it might be enough. The phone call to the antique food auction house in Nashville took 3 days to arrange. She drove home to Kentucky first, packed the kids up with the neighbor who sometimes watched them, and drove back to Carroll County alone. She photographed every single item in the storage space below the Cedar boards with a professional-grade camera she borrowed from a woman at the grocery store job who did photography on weekends. She numbered every bundle in a spreadsheet. She cross-referenced William's ledger dates with what she found below those boards. In the months that followed, her understanding of what William Ryder had built in that shed shifted from one thing to another. At first, she thought, a beekeeper's storage. A sentimental man keeping his best honey. Then, after more research, a collector. A man who understood that certain varieties in certain years from certain locations were not just food but documents, irreplaceable records of environments that were disappearing. Then, after the appraiser came, something else entirely. The appraiser was a woman named Dr. Renata Sousa, who worked out of a specialty auction house in Nashville that handled rare food items and agricultural antiquities. Nora found her through a university extension website after 2 weeks of searching, and Dr. Sousa drove to Carroll County on a gray Wednesday and stood in the shed for 4 hours and didn't say much for the first 2 of them. She said, while she was still crouched over the 3rd bundle she'd unwrapped, her voice neutral the way professional voices are when they're working hard not to telegraph emotion. Who else knows about this? Just me, Nora said. And you? Dr. Sousa stood. Looked at Nora with an expression that was somewhere between wonder and caution. She said, I want to be very careful about how I explain this to you, because I don't want to be irresponsible. But what you have here is not a hobbyist collection. Nora waited. Dr. Sousa pulled a small notebook from her bag and started writing. William Ryder had spent 40 years systematically curating what she described as a repository of pre-industrial American honey varietals. Tupelo from the Apalachicola Basin before large-scale commercial harvesting changed the flora composition of the region permanently. Tennessee sorghum honey from small family operations that no longer existed. Buckwheat honey from upstate New York farms that had been converted to other crops decades ago. Sourwood honey from specific mountain elevations in North Carolina. and several varietals that Dr. Sousa said she would need to have laboratory analyzed before she would feel comfortable estimating value, because she suspected they might be from apiaries and bloom sources that had not produced commercially since the 1970s. Nora stood in the cold shed and listened and held herself very still. The honey itself, Dr. Sousa said, was valuable. A sealed authenticated jar of pre-1990 Tupelo from the Apalachicola Basin had sold at auction recently for amounts that made the county's $1,900 assessment seem like a misprint. But the honey was not the most significant thing. William's ledger was. Because William had done something that almost no one in the world of heritage food had done at the time he started. He had documented everything. He had recorded provenance with the rigor of someone who understood, decades before anyone else in his field did. That documentation was what made preservation meaningful. Every jar had a record. Every source had a name and location. Every harvest had a date and a weight and a set of conditions William had noted in that careful, precise handwriting. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What you have, Dr. Sousa said, is a documented collection, and that changes everything about what it's worth. She named a preliminary range, not a final number. A range pending laboratory analysis and full documentation review. It was not $2,000. It was not $20,000. Nora drove back to the motel that night and called her mother. Her mother picked up on the second ring because her mother always picked up. She said, "Mama, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything." Her mother said, "Okay." Nora talked for 40 minutes. Her mother was quiet for most of it except for 2 moments. The first was when Nora told her what Daniel had left behind. Not the shed specifically. The mistake. The fact that in clearing out everything he deemed valuable, he'd left the one thing he'd dismissed as worthless. Her mother made a sound at that point that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry and existed somewhere in between. The second was when Nora told her what Dr. Sousa had said. The range. The possibility. Her mother was quiet for longer after that. Then she said, "William always knew things the rest of us didn't." Nora said, "You knew him?" Her mother said, "I met him twice, when you were very small. He was the kind of man who paid attention. He paid attention to things everyone else ignored, and he thought they'd matter one day." Did he ever say so? Her mother thought. He said, once, that the world was losing its memory faster than it knew. He said someone had to keep track of what was being lost, or it would just be gone. He was talking about bees when he said it. Nora held the phone and looked out the motel window at the parking lot, at the bare trees beyond it, at the gray early winter sky. He was keeping track for a long time, she said. Yes, her mother said. He was. The lab results took 6 weeks. Dr. Sousa communicated through email, careful language, no numbers. Yet, just preliminary findings, all of which indicated that the collection was what she had suspected it might be. In those 6 weeks, Nora vacated the house in Kentucky. She moved with Maya and Caleb into her mother's spare bedroom. 2 kids in one room. All of them in a house that was too small and too familiar and also, for the first time in a year, safe. Her mother made breakfast every morning. Caleb came out of his shell in a way that surprised her, louder than she'd seen him in months, following his grandmother around the kitchen asking questions about everything. Maya started reading again. She'd stopped for a while. Now she read every night before bed, the light on past when she was supposed to be sleeping, and Nora didn't have the heart to tell her to stop. She picked up more shifts at the grocery store. She paid off the minimum on the one credit card still active. She called a legal aid attorney who helped her file a report with the state regarding Daniel, regarding the credit cards, regarding the equity line. The attorney said it would take time. Everything was going to take time. She was learning to be okay with that. Daniel called once, in the 3rd week. She let it go to voicemail. He said something about how she'd understand someday, about how he wasn't built for this, about how he was sorry in the way people say sorry when they mean I'm sorry this happened, but not I'm sorry I did it. She listened to the voicemail twice and then deleted it and didn't call back. What he had done was something she was going to have to carry for a long time. She knew that. She was not going to pretend otherwise. There were nights in her mother's spare bedroom when the weight of it came down fully and she lay awake doing the kind of thinking that helped nothing but couldn't be stopped. The years she'd trusted. The signs she hadn't read. The particular loneliness of finding out that the person who was supposed to know you best had been building a door behind your back for years and never once let you see it. But there were other nights too. Nights when she thought about the shed. About William Ryder crouching over those boards with his careful hands, sealing another jar, writing another entry in the ledger, trusting that this was worth doing even if no one ever saw it. He'd died without anyone knowing. He'd left it all behind in a locked shed on a piece of land he'd signed over to a great niece he'd never met, and he'd let it go into the estate, and by some miracle of Daniel's arrogance and his own careful notation of ownership, it had come to her. She thought about that a lot in those 6 weeks. The lab results came on a Thursday morning, and Dr. Sousa called rather than emailing, which was the first indication. Her voice on the phone was different from the careful neutral of the first appraisal call. It was still professional. But there was something underneath the professional voice that Nora recognized as controlled excitement, the voice of someone who has been waiting to say a thing for several weeks. The analysis confirmed origin and age on 43 of the 47 samples, for were inconclusive due to crystallization that made radiocarbon dating less reliable, but Dr. Sousa said this would not affect their value meaningfully. The collection included, she said, reading from what sounded like a prepared list, 8 confirmed pre-1990 Tupelo varietals from the Apalachicola Basin, 7 Tennessee sorghum varietals from documented small operation sources, 3 of which had not been commercially active since the early 1980s, 4 buckwheat varietals from upstate New York farms, 2 sourwood varietals from specific Appalachian mountain elevations, and, here her voice shifted again, 1 varietal she had flagged for specialist review because its characteristics were unusual enough that she'd called in a colleague from the Food Sciences Department at Vanderbilt. This last sample was from 1987, the earliest date in the collection. William had labeled it only as Ozark Linden, private source, first year. The Vanderbilt specialist, Dr. Sousa said, had identified it as potentially being from a linden varietal that had largely disappeared from the Ozark region due to land clearing in the mid-1980s. If authenticated at the level her colleague suspected, this single jar was what she described as an extraordinary example of a lost agricultural heritage. She then named the full collection value estimate. The number was not in the hundreds of thousands. Nora was standing in the kitchen of her mother's house when she heard it, and she had to put her free hand on the counter because the floor seemed to have changed its relationship with her feet. She asked Dr. Sousa to repeat it. Dr. Sousa repeated it. She asked a clarifying question. She asked whether this was the range, meaning the low end, or the midpoint. Dr. Sousa said it was the midpoint of their estimate for auction, pending the final authentication of the linden sample. Nora thanked her and said she'd call back. She set the phone down on the counter very carefully. She stood in the kitchen of her mother's house for a while. She could hear her mother in the backyard talking to Caleb about something, the rise and fall of their voices coming through the window over the sink. She could hear Maya's footsteps upstairs, the particular rhythm of her walking to the bathroom and back. She picked the phone back up and called Dr. Sousa back. She said, "I want to understand the process from here. I want to understand exactly what we're doing next, and I want to do it carefully." Dr. Sousa said, "That's exactly the right approach." The town of Carroll County had its own way of learning things. That was what Nora came to understand in the weeks after she began working with Dr. Sousa to prepare the collection for authentication and eventual auction. She drove down twice more that winter, both times to let specialists into the shed, both times standing at the edge of the property while people she'd never met handled objects she still felt a fierce and protective instinct toward. On her second trip, a truck she didn't recognize pulled over on the road at the edge of the property. A man climbed out, mid-60s, overalls, the particular unhurriedness of someone who lived where time moved differently. He walked to the fence line, and she walked to meet him. He said, "You the Ryder heir?" She said, "I'm related to William Ryder, yes." He nodded. "His name was Glenn," he said, "and he'd sold William his first queen bees in 1981, and he'd been watching this property for 2 years since William died, making sure no one messed with it. The county had wanted to clear it for a road widening project," he said. He'd filed the objection 3 times. "Why?" Nora asked. He looked at the shed. William had something here. Didn't know what exactly, but he had something. You could tell by the way he was about this place. Man didn't go on vacation for 30 years. Wouldn't let anyone inside that shed. I figured whatever it was worth keeping until the right person came along. He looked back at her. You seem like the right person. She asked him what William had been like. Glenn was quiet for a moment. He said, William paid attention. Not to the things most people pay attention to. He paid attention to what was going away. He'd drive 3 hours to visit an old beekeeper who was the last one working a particular kind of bloom. He'd buy the last honey from a failing operation, and he'd write it down like he was writing down a person's name. He knew that when a thing was gone, it was gone. He wanted there to be a record that it had existed. She looked at the shed, the gray wood, the cloudy windows, the tin roof. She said, he left it to me. I never met him. Glenn nodded. He knew your mother's family. He used to say that records needed keepers, and keepers needed to care about what they were keeping. He said the right person would show up. He said he just had to hold on long enough. She drove home that night through the hills of Tennessee into the flatlands of Kentucky, and she thought about William Ryder paying attention to things that were going away. She thought about herself, 41 years old, sitting on a kitchen floor with $43, trying to calculate her way out of a disaster built by someone who hadn't paid attention to anything except his own exit. She thought about how the same qualities that had made Daniel dismiss the shed as worthless were the qualities that had made him underestimate her. He'd seen $2,000 on a county document and moved on. He'd never asked what was inside. She'd asked what was inside. That, she thought, driving north through the dark with the check engine light amber on the dashboard and the heater working better than usual, that was the thing. She'd asked. And William Ryder, 40 years ago in a county she'd never visited, had started building an answer. The specialist from Vanderbilt called on a Friday in February. His name was Dr. Marcus Webb, and he was an expert in pre-industrial American agricultural food systems, which was a field so specific that Nora hadn't known it existed until Dr. Sousa mentioned him. He spoke with the quick, dense precision of someone who'd spent 20 years becoming very knowledgeable about something that most people had never thought about at all. He said, Mrs. Whitfield, I want to be straightforward with you about what this linden sample represents, because I think you should understand the full context before we discuss value. She said, please. He said the Ozark linden tree, specifically a subspecies common to certain ridge elevations in the Boston Mountains and the White River Hills, had been a significant bloom source for beekeepers in that region from the 19th century through the mid-20th. The trees grew slowly, produced flowers only in mature stands, and had been heavily cleared during the agricultural expansion of the 1960s and 1970s. By the mid-1980s, the stands were largely gone. Commercial Ozark linden honey had not been produced at any meaningful scale since approximately 1985. William's sample, he said, was dated 1987, which meant it had been harvested from one of the last producing stands, possibly the very last. Laboratory analysis, he said, indicated a pollen and chemical profile consistent with this classification. If a final authentication through the National Honey Board's Heritage Panel confirmed their findings, this single jar of honey would represent what he called a terminal sample, the last documented harvest from a bloom source that no longer existed in viable form anywhere in the world. He paused. Then he said, in the world of heritage food, a terminal sample from a documented extinct source is in a different category than other rare foods. There are comparisons. A wine made from a vine variety that no longer grows. A cheese made from a milk source that has been discontinued. A grain variety last harvested 50 years ago. He said, the auction record for comparable heritage food terminal samples at the highest end of the market is not a number I'd feel comfortable committing to without the final authentication. But I want you to be prepared for a conversation that may surprise you. She thanked him. She set the phone down. She went and sat with her mother in the living room, where her mother was watching a crime drama, and Caleb was already asleep in the other room, and Maya was reading with the light on. Her mother looked at her and said, What? Nora said, I think William was keeping something more important than I understood. Her mother muted the television. Nora said, I think he knew something was going away and he decided to keep proof that it had existed. And I think proof of that kind, when it's done right and documented the way he documented it, turns out to be worth more than the thing itself. Her mother considered this for a long moment. She said, he would have liked that. He would have said that was exactly right. They sat together in the living room while the muted television flickered, and outside the Kentucky winter pressed against the windows, And 3 rooms away, 2 children slept without knowing yet that the shape of their lives was changing again, this time in the direction of something better. The authentication panel convened in March. Nora drove to Nashville for it, left the kids with her mother, wore the best clothes she owned, which was not saying much, and sat in a conference room at the Vanderbilt campus while 4 specialists examined William's linden jar and his ledger and the documentation Dr. Sousa had assembled. She was not in the room for most of it. She sat in a hallway on a hard chair and drank bad coffee, and scrolled through job listings on her phone the way she'd been doing every other day since January. A habit she hadn't broken even now, the habit of looking for ways to survive without counting on things that might not come through. Dr. Webb came out at 2 in the afternoon. He sat in the chair across from her and folded his hands and looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent a career delivering information and had learned to make his face say very little while he was doing it. He said, "The panel authenticated the sample." He said, "It is what we believed it to be." He said, "Regarding value, the panel has prepared a letter for auction purposes. The number in the letter is a floor, not a ceiling, because terminal sample authentication of this kind creates its own market at auction." He slid the letter across to her. She looked at the number. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the number, and the room was very quiet, and Dr. Webb sat across from her and didn't say anything, which she was grateful for. Then she looked up and said, "And the rest of the collection? The 46 other jars?" He said, "The full collection is estimated to auction in a range that Dr. Sousa has already communicated to you. The linden sample is valued separately, above that range, not included in it." She said, "So combined?" He said yes. She took a breath. She took another one. She said, "William Ryder was a beekeeper in Carroll County, Tennessee. He didn't go to college. He didn't have money. He spent 40 years by himself collecting jars of honey and writing things down in a ledger and locking them under a shed floor." Dr. Webb said, "He was a preservationist. He understood what mattered before anyone else did." She said, "And he left it to me." Dr. Webb said, "He left it to whoever would understand what it was." She looked out the conference room window at a March sky that was starting to think about spring, pale blue showing through the gray, the kind of sky that feels like a door opening. She thought about a shed full of jars, a ledger with 40 years of careful notes, a man who paid attention to what was going away and decided to hold on to proof that it had existed. She thought about a husband who'd looked at a county assessor's document and seen $1,900 and moved on. She thought about a kitchen floor, $43.17. 2 kids asleep upstairs. She thought about what it meant to pay attention to the right things. Then she picked up the letter, folded it carefully, put it in her bag, and walked out into the March air to call her mother. Her mother picked up before the second ring. Nora stood on the sidewalk outside the Vanderbilt building with the spring air just starting to feel like itself, the cold not gone but losing its grip, and she said, "Mama, I want to tell you something," and she told her. Her mother was quiet for a while, long enough that Nora said, "Are you still there?" Her mother said, "Yes, I'm here." Nora said, "It's enough to start over. Really start over. Pay off everything Daniel did. Get Maya and Caleb into a good school. Maybe find a real place to live." Her mother said, "More than that." Nora said, "Yes, more than that." Another pause. Then her mother said, "I want you to know that William was a good man. I know I said he was strange, but I said that the way people say things are strange when they don't understand them. He wasn't strange. He was different. He saw things that most people don't see." Nora said, "I know." Her mother said, "Your daddy always thought William was wasting his time. No wife, no children, out there with his bees. Said he'd die with nothing to show for it." Nora said, "He was wrong. He was wrong." Her mother agreed. William was building the whole time. He just wasn't building the things people expected him to build. She drove home to Kentucky through the turning landscape, the first green coming into the fields, the road familiar, and the car as worn as always with the check engine light still on, and she felt something that she spent most of the drive trying to name properly, because it was not one simple thing. There was relief. The specific physical relief of a weight lifting that you've carried so long you stopped noticing how much it was costing you to hold it. There was gratitude toward William, toward Glenn who'd filed objections to protect the property, toward Dr. Sousa and Dr. Webb, toward the neighbor who'd watched the kids, toward her mother who'd made breakfast every morning without ever once saying you should have seen this coming. There was grief, still, for the years, for the trust, For the version of herself who had believed she understood her life and had not. That grief wasn't going away. She knew that. It had settled into her like weather changes into old bones, something she was going to feel in certain conditions for a long time. But underneath all of it, something harder and cleaner than any of those things. She'd found the shed. She'd asked what was inside. She'd driven back when she could have said it's only $2,000 and let it sit. She'd photographed the ledger pages at 1 in the morning in a budget motel. She'd made the calls and driven back down and stood in the cold while specialists came and looked and thought and consulted. She'd filed the legal paperwork. She'd kept the kids steady and her mother reassured and the grocery store shifts consistent and the one credit card just barely alive. Daniel had left because he thought she couldn't hold it all together alone. She had held it all together alone. And he had left behind, in his careless certainty that it wasn't worth anything, the only thing that was worth everything. She pulled into her mother's driveway at 6 in the evening. The kitchen light was on. She could see her mother moving past the window. She sat in the car for a moment before going in. She thought about what happened next. Not the auction, not the number, not the practical architecture of rebuilding a life. She thought about what she was going to say to Maya and Caleb. How she was going to explain, in language appropriate to 9 and 6, that the hard year was going to give way to something better. That the things that had been taken from them were going to be replaced by things no one could take. Not legally, not in the night, not with a cleaned-out bank account and a door closed quietly on the way out. She thought about what she was going to tell Maya, specifically. Because Maya was 9 and had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of watching things carefully and not speaking until she was sure she understood what she was seeing. Maya had watched the last year with that careful attention, taking it in, filing it away, asking questions sometimes, and going quiet at other times in a way that told you she was still thinking about something from 3 days ago. Nora was going to tell Maya that William Ryder had paid attention to things that were going away, that he'd kept records of things no one else thought to keep, that he'd locked them under the floor of a shed on a piece of land he'd left to them, and that because of that, because of 40 years of patient attention and careful documentation, the worst year of their lives was also the last bad year for a long time. She was going to tell her that the lesson in that was not about honey. It was not about money, though money was part of it. The lesson was that the right kind of attention, paid to the right things, over time, accumulated into something real. That overlooked things were not always without value. That the thing everyone dismisses as worthless is sometimes the thing everything else depends on. She didn't know if a 9-year-old would understand all of that. But Maya was not a typical 9-year-old. And they had time now. They had, for the first time in a year, something that felt like time. She got out of the car and went inside. The kitchen smelled like chicken soup, which her mother made when she felt the need to do something tangible with her love. Caleb was at the kitchen table with crayons and a coloring book, working with great seriousness on something he'd decided needed to be entirely one shade of green. He looked up when she came in. "Mama." She sat beside him and looked at the drawing. "All green," she said. He said, "It's a forest. Forests are all green." She said, "That's true." Maya appeared in the doorway from the living room. Her expression was the same one it had been for months, watchful, reading her mother's face for information about the state of things. Nora looked at her daughter and let her face do the thing faces do when the answer is different from what it's been for a long time. Maya's shoulders dropped a little. "Not all the way, but enough." She said, "Was it good?" Nora said, "Yeah, baby. It was good." Maya nodded, came and sat on the other side of the table, and picked up a crayon without saying anything else. But the way she held the crayon was different. Lighter. Like something she'd been bracing against had shifted. Her mother set a bowl of soup in front of Nora without being asked. Sat across from her at the table. Looked at her with an expression that had been composed carefully. All the emotion pressed behind the normal face. In the way of mothers who have learned that showing too much sometimes makes things harder for the people they love. She said quietly, "All of it?" Nora said, "All of it." Her mother reached across and put her hand over Nora's, briefly, and then pulled it back and said, "Eat your soup while it's hot." After dinner, after Caleb was asleep and Maya was in bed with the light on, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and her notes and the letter from Vanderbilt and began doing what she'd been doing for months, making the next list of what came next. The auction would take time to arrange. Dr. Sousa had explained the process. Authentication documentation had to be finalized. The collection had to be transported and stored appropriately. The auction house would set a date, probably in the late summer or early fall. The marketing period before a sale of this significance would take several months. Meanwhile, there was the matter of the other properties William had referenced in the ledger. The hollow site, the ridge site, the far apiary. She'd found no record of them in the estate documents, but she hadn't looked hard enough yet. She added it to the list. There was the matter of what to do about Carroll County itself. The land, the shed, the 2 acres. She didn't want to sell it. She wasn't sure why, except that selling it felt like the wrong direction, like erasing something that should stay. There was the legal situation with Daniel, still being worked through. The credit cards, the equity line, the personal loan. The attorney had said it would take time. Most things worth doing took time. She made her lists. She drank the rest of her mother's soup, cold now, and didn't mind. She looked out the kitchen window at the Kentucky dark and thought about William Ryder in his shed, year after year, sealing jars and writing dates, and trusting that time would do what it does with things kept carefully. She thought about her great-uncle, whom she'd never met, who had spent his whole life by himself in Carroll County paying attention to what was going away, and who had held on to proof of it for 40 years in case someone came along who understood why that mattered. He hadn't known her. He'd only known she existed, somewhere out there, related to him by the long distances of family, and he'd decided that was enough. That the right keeper would come. That the thing he was protecting was worth holding on to until they did. She hadn't known him either. But she knew him now. She knew him in the handwriting of the ledger, careful and certain. She knew him in the way he'd constructed the storage space below the shed floor, measured and moisture-proofed and built to last. She knew him in the way Glenn had filed objections 3 times to keep the county road project away from his land, because a man who made people want to protect his work even after he was gone was a man worth knowing. She closed the laptop, set the letter from Vanderbilt in the folder she'd started labeling William's papers, because he'd kept records of everything and it seemed right to do the same in return. She turned off the kitchen light, walked to the bedroom door, and listened to her children breathing in the darkness. Caleb first. Even from here she could hear him, slightly loud, even in sleep, enthusiastic about everything including unconsciousness. Maya quieter, but she could hear her, too. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the doorframe, feeling the shape of the year that had been and the shape of what was coming. They were not the same shape. The shape that was coming had room in it. Space she hadn't felt in so long she'd started to think space wasn't something she was supposed to have. She went to bed. She lay in the dark of the spare room that had been hers for these months, and for the first time and longer than she could accurately remember, she fell asleep before the calculating started, before the lists reasserted themselves, before the arithmetic of surviving found its way back in. She just slept. Outside, the Kentucky spring was making its quiet progress, the fields greening at the edges, the trees starting to think about their leaves. The world, as it always does, going on with what it does regardless of the particular disasters and recoveries happening inside the houses scattered across it. 3 hours south and west, in Carroll County, Tennessee, a shed sat on 2 acres of land in the early dark. Silver gray wood and a tin roof and 2 cloudy windows and a padlock on the door with a key that now belonged to Nora Whitfield. Inside, a space below the cedar boards still held the careful arrangement that William Ryder had left, minus the 47 bundles now in temperature-controlled storage in Nashville. The ledger still hung on its hook beside the door. The shelves still held their old honey jars. The shed smelled of cedar and beeswax and thyme, and the smell did not know that the person who came next would understand what it contained. It only knew it had been kept well, and that was enough to get to this point. The rest of the story was only beginning. The first person to offer her money for the collection was not an auction house representative or a museum curator or a food historian with an academic interest in pre-industrial American agriculture. He was a man in a gray suit who showed up at her mother's front door on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks after the Vanderbilt authentication, holding a business card and smiling the particular smile of someone who has decided in advance that you will be grateful for this conversation. His name was Preston Hale, and he represented a private investment group based in Atlanta that specialized in what he called alternative asset acquisition. He knew about the authentication. He knew about the Linden sample. He knew about Dr. Sousa and the auction house and the timeline. He said he knew all of this because the authentication process involved documentation that moved through several institutional channels, and his firm monitored those channels as a matter of routine. Nora stood in her mother's doorway in the clothes she'd put on for a grocery store shift starting in 2 hours and listened to him explain his offer. The investment group was prepared to purchase the entire collection outright, he said, avoiding the uncertainty and weight of the public auction process, settling the matter quickly, allowing her to move on with her life. He named a number. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that would have made the version of herself from 6 months ago, sitting on the kitchen floor with $43, feel something close to disbelief. It was also, she had already calculated before he finished speaking, significantly below what Dr. Sousa's midpoint estimate indicated the auction would achieve. And it was very far below what the Linden sample alone was expected to generate. She said, "I'm not interested." His smile didn't change. People in his line of work train their smiles to be weatherproof. He said, "I want to make sure you understand the full picture here. Auctions are unpredictable. Authentication can be challenged. The market for heritage food is niche, and niche markets can disappoint. We're offering certainty." She said, "I understand the offer. I'm not interested." He tried a second angle, slower this time, more careful. He mentioned the legal situation with her husband. Not directly, not with details that would reveal how much he actually knew, but in the elliptical way of someone signaling awareness without admitting surveillance. He said something about how a quick resolution to the estate question might simplify other ongoing complications. She said, "Please don't come back to this house." She closed the door. She stood inside for a moment. Then she called Dr. Sousa and told her about the visit. Dr. Sousa was quiet for a beat, then said, "This will happen more than once. Word gets out. It always does. The authentication process is documented, and those documents move through several hands. I should have warned you earlier." Nora said, "How do I make it stop?" Dr. Sousa said, "You can't make it stop entirely. What you can do is make clear that you're informed, that you have representation, and that you are not going to be moved by pressure. People like this are calculating whether you're desperate enough to take less than what the collection is worth. Once they determine you're not, they move on." Nora said, "I'm not desperate." Dr. Sousa said, "I know. Make sure they know it, too." 2 more approaches followed in the next 3 weeks. One was a phone call from someone who identified himself as a collector who preferred to remain private and offered a number higher than Preston Hale's, but still comfortably below auction estimate. The other was a letter, formal and legal-looking, from an attorney representing an entity she'd never heard of, suggesting that Williams' documentation of provenance might be subject to dispute if certain prior claims could be substantiated. She forwarded the letter to her own attorney, the legal aid lawyer who'd been helping her with the Daniels situation and who had since, after reviewing what was happening with the collection, connected her with a property and estate specialist who'd agreed to take her case on a deferred fee basis against the auction proceeds. The estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei who operated out of Nashville and had the particular economy of language that came from decades of watching people lose things they should have kept, reviewed the letter and called Nora directly. She said, "This is a pressure tactic. There are no prior claims. Williams' ledger establishes provenance more thoroughly than most formal estate documents I've seen. Whoever sent this is hoping you'll either panic and sell or spend money defending against a claim that would collapse immediately in court." Nora said, "What do I do?" Patricia said, "Nothing. I'll respond on your behalf. They'll drop it within 2 weeks." She was right. The letter generated no follow-up. What it did generate, in Nora, was something she was somewhat surprised by. Not fear. Not the anxiety she'd have expected from the version of herself a year ago. Something quieter and more purposeful. A clarity about what she was doing and why, and a corresponding steadiness in the face of people who were counting on her not to have it. Daniel had built his exit on the assumption that she was manageable, that she would not look closely at the right things, that she would believe what she was told because she had always believed what she was told, and that this was a permanent feature of her character rather than a circumstance of trust that could be revised. These men in gray suits, and their phone calls, and their legal letters were making the same calculation. She was a woman in her 40s in a borrowed spare bedroom working grocery store shifts, and she had fallen into something valuable by accident, and therefore she could be moved. They were wrong about the same thing Daniel had been wrong about. They thought the circumstances were the person. They had not paid attention to what was actually there. She kept paying attention. In late April, she drove back to Carroll County alone. A Saturday, the kind of spring day that makes the Tennessee hills look like someone spent time on them. She met Glenn at the property fence line. He'd called her 2 days earlier to say there was something she needed to see. He took her to the back of the property, to the stand of cedar trees along the boundary line, and he showed her something she'd missed on her first visits because she hadn't known to look for it. Set into the slope at the back of the property, almost entirely concealed by a decade of grown-over brush and fallen branches, was a door. Heavy wood, set into a low concrete frame in the hillside. It took her and Glenn 40 minutes to clear enough brush to open it. The hinges were stiff but not rusted through. The door opened onto a space carved into the slope, low-ceilinged and earthen-floored, maybe 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide. A root cellar, Glenn said, old one. Predates the shed by 50 years, probably. Inside, on rough wooden shelves built against the earthen walls, were more jars. Not honey, or not primarily. Glass jars sealed the old way, with wire bales and rubber gaskets, the kind of sealing that kept things for a very long time if conditions were right. And conditions in this hillside root cellar, she understood as she stood in it, were very right. The temperature was constant, somewhere in the mid-50s, and the humidity was low. The shelves were dry. She took her phone out and started photographing. Glenn stood at the entrance, looking in with an expression she'd come to recognize in the people who'd known William. A mix of recognition and something close to grief, the way people look when they find evidence of a person they miss. He said, "I didn't know about this." He never said. She said, he kept a lot of things he didn't say. The jars on the shelves were labeled in William's handwriting, but the labels here were different from the bundles in the shed. These were not honey jars. These were other things. Seed packets, dozens of them, sealed in wax, labeled with plant names she recognized some of, and some she didn't. Fruit preserves, dated, the labels naming varieties she'd have to look up. And along the bottom shelf, in old tin boxes sealed with electrical tape, a collection of papers. Folded documents, tied with twine, each bundle labeled in William's consistent hand. She picked up one tin box carefully, set it on the earthen floor, and worked the tape open and unfolded the top document. It was a deed. She looked at it. Carroll County, Tennessee. Land description, acreage, legal boundaries. Owner of record, William Thomas Ryder. She picked up another bundle. Another deed. Different parcel number. Different acreage, same county, same owner. There were 6 tin boxes on that bottom shelf. She did not open all of them that day. She photographed the exterior of each box and the top document of each stack and closed everything back up and called Patricia Osei on the drive back to the motel, speaking fast, laying it out. Patricia said, "Can you send me the photographs right now?" She pulled over on the highway shoulder and sent them. Patricia called back in 11 minutes. Her voice had the particular careful quality it got when something was more significant than routine. She said, "Nora, these look like property deeds. Multiple parcels. I can't determine acreage or value from these photographs, but I can tell you this is not a small thing. I need to see these documents in person. Can you bring the boxes to Nashville?" She drove to Nashville the next morning with the tin boxes in the back seat, wrapped in the clean towels her mother had insisted she take, because her mother expressed care in towels and soup and small practical gestures that said, "I am taking this seriously," even when she said nothing directly. Patricia spent 3 hours with the documents. Nora sat in the waiting room of the Nashville office and called her mother and talked about nothing important, which was the best kind of conversation, the kind that existed just to keep someone company. Patricia came out at 2 o'clock with the expression she'd had when she called Preston Hale's letter a pressure tactic. Economical, direct, certain. She spread 4 of the deeds on the conference table and said, "William Ryder owned additional land. Not just the 2.3 acres you inherited. These deeds indicate 4 separate parcels in Carroll County, 1 in Benton County, and 1 in Henderson County. All of them fully owned, no liens, no mortgages, all current on property taxes as of last year's records." Nora said, "They were current on taxes? Even after he died?" Patricia said, "He set up an automatic payment from an account. Old-fashioned setup, bank draft from an account in his name that appears to have had enough in it to cover the taxes for some years still. He thought ahead." Nora looked at the deeds. She said, "How much land?" Patricia ran through the parcel sizes. The 4 Carroll County parcels totaled 63 acres. The Benton County parcel was 22 acres. The Henderson County parcel was 31 acres. Combined with the original 2.3, just over 118 acres across 3 counties. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, the ledger. He mentioned the hollow site and the ridge site and the far apiary. Those were properties. Patricia said, almost certainly. He was running an operation across multiple sites and owned the land under all of it. Nora said, what's it worth? Patricia said, I'll need appraisals on each parcel. Rural Tennessee land values vary considerably by location, soil, timber, water access. But I can tell you that 118 acres across 3 counties, held free and clear, is not nothing. It is very much not nothing. It was not nothing. The appraisals came back over the following 3 weeks, 1 parcel at a time, each report landing in Nora's email with a specificity that made the numbers feel more real than they had when they were still abstract possibilities. Rural land, timber eligible, with water access on 2 of the parcels. Prices per acre that varied by site but were all above county averages because William, it became clear as the appraisers reported back, had selected land the way he selected honey sources. Carefully, with attention to what it would be worth not just now but later. She sat at her mother's kitchen table one Thursday evening in May and added the land appraisal totals to the collection estimate, and she sat with that combined number for a while. Then she called Patricia. She said, I want to understand something. Is there anything else? Any other accounts? Any other holdings? Anything in the estate we haven't found yet? Patricia said, I'm still working through the financial records. The bank account that covers the property taxes appears to be one of at least 3 accounts William held. I'm waiting on responses from 2 institutions. But Nora, I want to say something to you directly. She said, go ahead. Patricia said, what you've found so far is already significant. What it represents, beyond the financial value, is that William Ryder spent decades building something with intention. He wasn't a man who stumbled into wealth. He was a man who accumulated carefully and deliberately over a very long time. When I see an estate structured the way this one is, the property held free and clear, the taxes automated, the collection documented the way his was, I see someone who was thinking about what happened after, who was building it for a specific purpose. Nora said, he left it to me. He didn't even know me. Patricia said, he knew enough. He knew who you were in the family structure. He chose you. Nora said, why not my mother? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's a question only William could have answered. But if I had to speculate based on what I know of estates like this, I'd say he wanted it to go to someone young enough to do something with it. Someone with enough life still ahead to build on what he built. He was thinking forward. She thought about that for a long time after the call. She thought about William deciding, from whatever distance, to leave his life's work to a great niece he'd never met, and the kind of faith that required. Not faith in a specific person, exactly. Faith in the right person showing up. Faith that whoever came and looked would understand what was worth paying attention to. She had shown up. She had looked. The bank accounts came back in June. There were 3 of them. The property tax account, a second account, a savings account at a credit union in Huntingdon, which was the county seat of Carroll County, holding a sum that Patricia communicated to her in a phone call with the same careful verbal economy she used for everything, naming the number once, clearly, and then waiting. The third account was at a different institution and held a smaller balance, but the account statements Patricia received from the executor of William's estate, who was a local attorney in Huntingdon named Howard Briggs, who had managed William's affairs for 20 years and had been trying without success to locate Nora for months before Patricia found him. The statements showed regular deposits. Monthly, going back 15 years. Small amounts, consistent amounts, from a source labeled only as royalties. She said, royalties from what? Howard Briggs, when she called him, laughed quietly. He said, William was a patient man. He licensed the documentation of several of his heritage varieties to a university agricultural program in 1994. He updated the licensing agreement every 5 years. It generated a small but consistent income for 25 years. He never spent any of it. Just let it accumulate. She said, he licensed his records. Howard said, he understood that the documentation was as valuable as the physical collection. Maybe more so. A scientist can analyze a jar of honey and learn something about what it is, but without provenance documentation, without the chain of custody and the harvest conditions and the source mapping. It's just an interesting sample. With all of that, it becomes a resource that can be studied, replicated in some contexts, understood in relationship to other data. William knew that before the people he was licensing to knew it. He was ahead of the idea. She thanked Howard and sat with this new layer of the story. William had not just collected. He had licensed. He had understood, decades before it was commonly understood, that information about things was often more valuable than the things themselves. That documentation was its own form of wealth, not liquid, not immediately legible to the people around him, but real. She thought about Daniel, who'd looked at a county assessment and seen $1,900 and moved on. She thought about what it meant to actually see something. The auction was scheduled for the third Saturday of September. Dr. Sousa had managed the process with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before and understood that the preparation was more than half the outcome. The collection had been documented in a catalog that would be distributed to serious buyers across the country and in several countries beyond. The Linden sample had its own section in the catalog, its own specialist notes, its own provenance chain laid out in a clarity that made it impossible to dispute. In August, a food journalist from a magazine based in New York called and asked if she'd consent to an interview. The story of the collection had gotten out, the way these things do, through the channels Dr. Sousa had warned her about, through the authentication documentation and the auction house publicity and the Carroll County property records that were, like all property records, technically public. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she called Patricia and asked what she thought. Patricia said, "Tell your story in your own words before someone else tells it in theirs." She gave the interview. The journalist, a woman named Sasha Torres who asked better questions than Nora had expected, came to Carroll County and met her at the property. They stood in front of the shed in the August heat, green everywhere, the land fully in its summer, and Nora talked about William and about the ledger and about what it meant to find something everyone had dismissed as worthless and discover it was anything but. She talked about Daniel, too. Not extensively, not with bitterness, which surprised her a little when she heard herself speaking. She said that the worst year of her life had ended with her standing in a shed in Carroll County, Tennessee, and that the shed existed because a man she'd never met had spent 40 years paying attention to the right things. She said that the word worthless was doing a lot of work in the story people were going to tell about this, and she wanted to push back on that word. William hadn't built something worthless that turned out to be worth something. He'd built something of profound worth that the people around it had been too careless to notice. The worth was always there. The attention just hadn't been. The article came out in early September, 2 weeks before the auction. It was longer than she'd expected, more careful with her story than she'd feared. The headline was straightforward, not sensational, and the piece spent as much time on William as it did on her, which was what she'd asked for and what she'd half expected not to get. The response to the article was what changed the last 2 weeks before the auction. Her phone stopped being a manageable object. Emails came faster than she could read them. Some were from people she'd never heard of, collectors and institutions and journalists wanting a follow-up, wanting a quote, wanting a piece of this story. But some of them were other things. Letters from people who'd read about William's work and were moved by it, people who kept bees, people who'd grown up on farms with varieties of crops and fruits that no longer existed commercially, people who wanted to know if there was someone to talk to about preserving what they still had. One email was from a woman in upstate New York, in her 80s, whose family farm had kept a strain of buckwheat that had diverged from commercial varieties over 100 years of separate cultivation. She'd read about William, and she'd read about Nora, and she said she'd been trying to figure out what to do with the seeds and the documentation and the 40 years of farm records her father had left, and she thought maybe this was the person to ask. Nora forwarded that email to Dr. Webb at Vanderbilt. She wrote in her note to him, "I think this is the beginning of something. Can we talk?" He called within the hour. He said, "I've been hoping you'd want to have this conversation." The auction was a Saturday in September. She drove to Nashville with her mother and both kids, Maya in the back seat with a book she'd been reading for 2 days straight, and Caleb with a handheld game and a bag of crackers. Her mother sat in the passenger seat and didn't say much for most of the drive, which was her mother's way of being present without making it about herself. The auction house was in a part of Nashville Nora had never been in before, a district of galleries and specialty dealers that existed in the city's geography, the way certain things exist in any city, specific and self-contained, visible only to people looking for it. The building was brick, 19th century, with a discreet sign and a parking lot that held several cars that cost more than the house she'd vacated in March. Dr. Sousa met them at the door and took them to a private room where they could watch the auction proceedings on a screen without being in the room itself. She explained this was standard for sellers in situations like this one, that the atmosphere of the auction floor was something it was better to observe from a small distance, that the numbers moved fast, and it was easier to track what was happening from here. Maya sat beside Nora and watched the screen with her reading face on, focused, absorbing, filing things away. Caleb ate crackers and asked every 15 minutes when it was going to start and was answered each time by his grandmother with patient specificity. The auction started at 10 in the morning. The collection was not the first lot, or the second, or even the third. It was the fifth item of the day. Dr. Sousa had explained that placement in an auction sequence was strategic. That fifth position was where you put things you wanted maximum attention for. After the room had warmed up and the bidders had confirmed they were real, and before the energy of the room peaked and fell, the first 4 lots moved through with the speed of something well-practiced. The auctioneer's voice was measured and fast. Numbers climbed and stopped. Paddles moved. She watched and tried to understand the rhythm of it. The 5th lot came up on the screen. The catalog image appeared first. The collection displayed in its full documentation, the individual bottles in their cloth wrapping, the ledger in its protective case, the full provenance chain laid out in clean lines. The opening bid was set. Nora had known it was coming. Patricia had explained the process, but hearing it stated aloud in that room's specific acoustics still made something in her chest tighten. The bidding began. It moved faster than she expected, not in a chaotic way, but with the purposeful speed of people who had already decided what they wanted and were now engaged in the practical business of determining what it would cost them. The number climbed, paused, climbed again, paused at a number that was already above Dr. Seuss's midpoint estimate for the collection without the Linden sample. Then the Linden lot came in as part of the combined bid, and the room changed. She could tell it changed even through the screen. The energy of it was different. The pauses between bid increments lengthened, which Dr. Sousa, watching beside her, said was the sign of serious buyers calculating hard. When bidders paused that way, she said quietly, it meant the numbers mattered to them. It meant they were at the edge of what they'd committed to and were deciding whether to go past it. The number on the screen went past the upper range of Dr. Seuss's estimate. Nora looked at the number. She looked at it for a while. Caleb said, "Is something happening?" Her mother said softly, "Yes, sweetheart. Something is happening." The bidding closed. The gavel came down. The number on the screen was the final number. It was the number that was real. She sat in the private room in Nashville with her mother and her children and did not say anything for a long moment. She was aware of Maya looking at her face the way Maya always did, reading it for information. She was aware of Caleb starting to sense from the room's stillness that something had concluded, something important, and going quiet in the way small children sometimes go quiet when they feel the weight of adult things. She was aware of Dr. Sousa beside her with professional composure entirely intact except for the line of her shoulders, which had dropped a fraction of an inch, the way shoulders drop when a thing you worked hard toward arrives exactly as it should. Maya said quietly, "Mom, what does that number mean?" Nora turned to her daughter. 9 years old, careful eyes, the particular watchfulness of a child who had learned this year that the world could change fast and that it was better to see it coming. She said, "It means we're okay. It means we're more than okay." Maya looked at the screen, then back at her mother. She said, "Because of the bees?" "Because of William," Nora said. "Because he paid attention to things that were going away and he kept track of them and he left the records behind." Maya thought about this in the focused way she thought about things. Then she said, "And because you asked what was inside." Nora felt something shift in her chest. She said, "Yeah, and because I asked what was inside." Her mother, who had been very quiet through all of this, reached over and took both of their hands, Maya's and Nora's, one in each of hers, and held them without saying anything. Outside the small private room, in the larger world of the auction floor, other lots were moving through their paces. The day was continuing as days continue. But in this room, for this particular arrangement of people, something had finished and something else was beginning, and all of them felt it, even Caleb, who put down his crackers and leaned. against his grandmother's arm and looked at the screen without asking what was happening, because for once the stillness told him everything he needed to know. Dr. Sousa stepped outside to handle the post-auction paperwork. The four of them sat together for a little while longer. Not talking mostly, just sitting. It was Caleb who finally broke it. He said, "Can we get lunch? I'm really hungry." And Nora laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from the chest, and her mother laughed, and even Maya laughed, and Caleb looked around at all of them laughing and grinned because he didn't entirely know what was funny, but he knew it wasn't bad. They got lunch. A place 3 blocks from the auction house that was nicer than anything they'd been to in more than a year. She let the kids order whatever they wanted. Her mother ordered the fish and said it was excellent, and then ate every bite with the deliberate satisfaction of someone who rarely let themselves have exactly what they wanted. Nora ordered something she'd been thinking about for an abstract, unreasonable number of months. A specific thing she'd seen on a menu once before the year went wrong and had told herself she'd get someday. She ate it slowly. It was exactly right. After lunch, she called Patricia. Patricia confirmed the post-auction timeline, the transfer of funds, the legal structure, the tax implications. She said the process would take some weeks to clear fully, but that there were no complications on the horizon. Then she said, "Nora, I want to say something that's outside my formal role here." Nora said, "Go ahead." Patricia said, "I've handled estates for 20 years. I've seen people inherit things and lose them and waste them and be destroyed by them and be saved by them. What you've done with this estate, the way you've handled it from the moment you found the documentation through everything that's followed, is not what most people do." Nora said, "What do most people do?" Patricia said, "Most people panic. Or they sell too fast to the first credible offer because the fear of losing it is bigger than the understanding of what they have. Or they get so focused on the money that they lose track of what the money came from and why it matters. You didn't do any of that." Nora said, "I was scared the whole time." Patricia said, "I know. That's what I'm telling you. Being scared and doing the right thing anyway is the actual definition of what I just described. Don't minimize it." She held the phone and looked out the restaurant window at the Nashville street, at the people moving past, at the afternoon light on the brick of the buildings across the road. She said, "William spent 40 years being scared no one would understand what he was building." Patricia said, "And then you did." She said, "And then I did." The weeks after the auction were the weeks of logistics, which were not glamorous and were not the part of the story anyone would remember, but which were essential and real. The funds transfer, the debt payoff, Daniel's entire architecture of damage dismantled line by line, each account settled and closed, each obligation lifted. The conversation with the legal aid attorney about the formal divorce filing, which was proceeding and would continue proceeding, and which she had stopped thinking of as a crisis and started thinking of as paperwork. She found a house to rent in Nashville. A real house, not a spare bedroom, with a yard and enough rooms that Maya and Caleb each had their own space, which they had not had for a year, and which they settled into with the particular relief of children who've been sharing a room and are too polite to have said how much they hated it. Her mother visited the first weekend and walked through every room and said it was a good house. She said it with the care of someone who meant more than the words. Nora enrolled Maya and Caleb in new schools. Maya started 7th grade at a school with an actual library and a history teacher she liked immediately. Caleb started 2nd grade, and within 3 weeks had a best friend named Owen who came over every Saturday. She gave her notice at the grocery store. The manager said she was sorry to see her go, and Nora said she was grateful for the shifts and meant it, because you could be grateful for survival and also be glad to be done surviving. She began working with Dr. Webb at Vanderbilt. Not formally, not yet, but the conversations they'd been having about the upstate New York farm woman and her buckwheat seeds and the other letters that had arrived after the magazine article were becoming something with a shape to it. He used the word foundation once, and she said, "That's the word I've been thinking, too." And there was a long pause on the phone that felt like recognition. She drove to Carroll County in October. Fall had come to the Tennessee hills and the land was in its most beautiful season, the oaks and maples doing what they did in October, orange and gold, and the particular sharp red that only happens for a few weeks before it's over. She drove the familiar road, the turn onto gravel, the curve to the clearing. She stood in front of the shed in the October light. Glenn was there. He'd been there when she arrived, sitting in his truck at the fence line with a thermos of coffee, the way he always was when she came down, as if he'd been told she was coming even when she hadn't called. He got out, and they stood together at the edge of the property and looked at the shed. She said, "I've been thinking about what to do with the land." He said, "I figured you were." She said, "I don't want to sell it." He nodded. He'd known that already too, she suspected. She said, "William spent 40 years preserving things that were going away. The honey was the mechanism. But the idea was bigger than that. The idea was that when something disappears from the world without anyone keeping track of it, something is lost that can't be recovered. Not just the thing itself. The knowledge of what the thing was." Glenn looked at the shed. He said, "William would have said you put that well." She said, "I want to do something here. On this land. Something that continues what he was doing. He was a beekeeper, and I'm not. But the principle isn't about bees." Glenn said, "What's the principle?" She said, "The principle is that overlooked things have value. That paying attention to what's going away is its own form of work, serious work, necessary work, and that someone has to do it or the record disappears with the thing." Glenn was quiet for a while. The October wind moved through the cedars along the back boundary. The shed's tin roof made a small sound in it. He said, "I know 4 beekeepers in this county working heritage varieties. Old strains they've kept for 30, 40 years. Nobody knows about them except the beekeepers themselves. When those men die, the strains die with them." She said, "Can you introduce me?" He said, "I can do that." She said, "I'd like to establish something here. On this land. A center, maybe, or a foundation, something formal enough to hold records and informal enough to actually work. Where people like William, people who've been keeping track of going things, can bring what they know. Where the documentation can be kept and built on and made available to researchers who understand what it's worth." Glenn looked at her. He had the expression of someone hearing a thing said clearly that they've understood privately for a long time. He said, "William would have wanted that." She said, "I think he was building toward it. I think he just ran out of time." Glenn said, "Most people do." She said, "We have the land. We have the records. We have the collection as a foundation. And we have enough, now, to actually do it right." He said, "You'll need people." She said, "I know. I'm working on it." She walked to the shed and unlocked it and went inside. The cedar and beeswax smell was the same as the first time, layered and old, the particular smell of a place that has been tended for a long time. The shelves were mostly empty now, the collection in Nashville. But the ledger still hung on its hook beside the door. She lifted it down carefully, opened it to the last entry William had written. She'd read it before, but she read it again now, standing in the October light coming through the cloudy windows. The handwriting in the last entry was the smallest, the most careful, the handwriting of someone whose hands were not entirely steady anymore and who was compensating by slowing down. He'd written, "The record is the gift. The thing itself perishes. The record is what persists. Whoever finds this, understand that the work is in the keeping, not the having. The keeping." She stood in the shed for a while with the ledger in her hands. Then she put it carefully in the bag she'd brought and walked back outside into the October afternoon. Glenn was waiting at the fence. She walked to him. He said, "Well?" She said, "We have work to do." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. He said, "I know a few people who've been waiting on someone to say that." She drove back to Nashville that evening through the Tennessee hills going gold in the late light. And she thought about William Ryder locking the door of his shed for the last time, trusting the padlock and the years and the right person to eventually find it. She thought about 40 years of patience, of careful labels and sealed jars and entries in a ledger that no one was reading but him. She thought about what it meant to build something you wouldn't live to see completed, to trust the future with the work you'd done, to believe, without any evidence except your own conviction, that the thing you were paying attention to was worth the attention. She thought about Maya and Caleb asleep in their new rooms in the Nashville house. She thought about the upstate New York woman with the buckwheat seeds and the farm records and the 40 years of documentation she didn't know what to do with. She thought about Glenn's beekeepers, their heritage strains going undocumented, waiting for someone to ask. She thought about the wrong things people called worthless because they hadn't looked closely enough. She drove north through the Gold Hills and let herself feel, fully, without managing it, what the year had been. All of it. The kitchen floor. The $43. The closed bank account and the shoebox of unopened letters and the children asleep upstairs not knowing yet. The 3-hour drive to Carroll County in November with the check engine light on and Caleb asleep in his booster seat, and a motel booking she'd put on a credit card that was almost gone. The shed door swinging open. The cedar and beeswax smell. The ledger on its hook. The bundles under the cedar boards. Dr. Sousa's voice on the phone, telling her what the linden sample was. The number on the screen in the auction room in Nashville, and her mother holding her hand. She let herself feel all of it, the fear and the grief and the exhaustion, and underneath all of it, underneath everything that had happened this year, something that had been there the whole time and that she recognized now for what it was. William Ryder had paid attention to what was going away, and he'd kept track of it, and he'd trusted it to the right person. She had paid attention to what was in the shed, and she'd kept asking, and she'd built on what he left. The work continued. It always continued. That was what she understood now that she hadn't understood before. The work was not something that finished. It was something that passed from one set of hands to the next, each person keeping it alive long enough to find the next keeper, the record growing, the understanding deepening, the thing that might have been lost instead becoming something that persisted. She took the next exit toward Nashville, toward home, toward the work that was waiting. The first real conversation she had with Maya about all of it, the complete shape of it, happened on a Sunday morning in October. Nora had been putting it off, not because she wanted to hide anything, but because there was a version of telling a child about money that felt wrong to her, performative in a way that didn't honor what the year had actually been. But Maya had been asking questions for weeks. Small ones, sideways ones, the kind of questions 9-year-olds ask when they already know more than they're letting on and are waiting for the adult to catch up. She asked them over breakfast, over things like, "Mom, is that the reason we moved here? And is this why you stopped working at the grocery store? And is the shed place why things changed?" Yes, Nora told her, each time. Yes to all of those. On the Sunday in October, they sat at the kitchen table after Caleb had gone to his friend Owen's house, and Nora said, "I want to tell you the whole story, if you want to hear it." Maya said, "I do." She told her. Not everything. Not every financial detail. Not the number on the auction screen. Not yet. Those were adult specifics that a 9-year-old didn't need to carry. But the shape of it. What the year had been. What Daniel had done. What the shed had contained. Who William Ryder was. And what he'd spent his life doing and why it had mattered. She told Maya about the ledger and the bundles under the cedar boards and the root cellar and the tin boxes and the 118 acres across 3 counties and what Patricia had said about William thinking forward. She told her about Dr. Sousa and the authentication and what the linden honey was, the terminal sample from a bloom source that no longer existed, the last documented proof that a particular thing had been real. Maya listened the way she listened to everything. Completely, without interrupting, her face still and focused. When Nora finished, Maya said, "He kept the last one, so there'd be proof it happened." Nora said, "Yes." Maya said, "And now we're going to do the same thing for other things that are going away." Nora said, "That's what I'm hoping." Maya said, "I want to help." Nora looked at her daughter. The particular 9-year-old seriousness of her, the watchful eyes, the steadiness that had come from a hard year and had turned into something she would carry the rest of her life. She said, "I know, and I'm going to let you." Maya thought for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think William was lonely?" Nora had been thinking about this for months. She said, "I think he made a choice between connection and attention, and he chose attention. I don't know if he was lonely. I think he might have been at peace." Maya said, "But we don't have to choose." Nora said, "No, we don't." Maya nodded like this was the conclusion to something she'd been working through. Then she said, "Can I see the shed sometime?" Nora said, "Yes. We'll go together." She thought about that later, about what Maya had said. We don't have to choose. The clarity of it, the simplicity of seeing what adults complicated. William had chosen attention over connection because those had been, in his time and his particular circumstances, competing demands. The work of paying attention to disappearing things had required the kind of sustained focus that closeness interrupted. He'd built his life around the work because he'd believed the work was what mattered, and he hadn't been wrong. The work had mattered enormously, but he'd been alone, and he'd kept things locked under the floor and trusted the right person to come. And what he hadn't fully calculated was that the right person might be able to do it differently. With people around her. With her mother making soup and her daughter asking to help, and an old beekeeper sitting in a truck at the fence line with a thermos of coffee, filing county objections on behalf of a dead man's work because he thought it deserved to survive. William had done it alone because he'd had to. Nora didn't have to. That, she thought, was perhaps the other thing he'd left her. Not just the collection and the land and the accounts. The proof that the work itself was worth doing, which freed her to do it differently, better, with the people who showed up when you needed them. The foundation paperwork was filed in November. She'd worked with Patricia and Dr. Webb through September and October to structure it properly, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the documentation and preservation of pre-industrial American agricultural heritage, with a particular focus on honey varieties, seed stocks, and farm records from small operations that were otherwise undocumented. She named it the Ryder Foundation. Patricia had said she could name it anything, and she'd thought about it for a while, and she'd come back to the only name that made sense. It was his work. She was continuing it. The name should say so. The Carroll County land became the foundation's home base. She hired a contractor to restore the shed, not to modernize it, but to make it sound without changing what it was. The root cellar was cleaned and reshelved and made properly climate-controlled. A second building, small and practical, went up 20 feet from the shed, housing the administrative functions of the foundation, the record systems, the meeting space. Glenn organized the introductions to the 4 Carroll County beekeepers with heritage strains. She visited each of them over 2 days in November, sat in their barns and their kitchens and their fields, and listened to them talk about their bees the way William had talked in the ledger, with the specific love of someone who had paid attention for a very long time to something most people walked past. She told each of them about the foundation, about what she was building, about William and what he'd understood about documentation and why it mattered. Each of them said some version of the same thing. I've been waiting for someone to ask. The upstate New York woman, whose name was Helen Marsh, drove to Nashville in December. She was 81 years old and drove herself the entire way, which Nora had offered to help with and Helen had declined firmly. She arrived with 3 boxes of farm records, a collection of seed samples in carefully sealed containers, and a disposition toward the whole enterprise that Nora recognized immediately as the same disposition William must have had, measured, certain, not looking for validation, just looking for the right place to put a thing she'd been keeping. They sat together in the Nashville house and went through the records. Helen talked about her father, who'd started the documentation in the 1950s when he'd noticed the commercial buckwheat market moving away from the variety their farm had always grown. He'd kept the strain going out of stubbornness, she said, and then out of something closer to conviction, and then she'd kept it after him out of the same compound of stubbornness and conviction. Helen said, I didn't know what to do with it. I'm 81. I'm not going to be keeping it much longer. Nora said, we'll keep it. Helen looked at her. She had the eyes of someone who had looked at a lot of things closely for a long time. She said, I read the article about you. About the shed. Nora said, yes. Helen said, you understand what it's about. Not the money. Nora said, not the money. Helen said, good. Then I'll leave it with you. She drove back to New York the next morning, straight back the way she'd come, and she left the boxes of records and the seed samples on Nora's kitchen table, and they went to Carroll County the following week, into the climate-controlled root cellar, cataloged and documented, and added to the record that was growing now, month by month, in the place where William Ryder had started it. The county assessor's office called in December. Not about the property, not about taxes. A woman named Marie who'd read the article and who'd been working in the assessor's office for 20 years and who said she'd had a thought. She said, when people die and leave estates, especially older people with rural properties, the assessments we do are based on visible, taxable assets. We look at land value, structure value. We don't look inside. Nora said, I know. Marie said, I've been thinking about how many times I've assessed a property as low value and what might have been inside that no one looked at. Farms especially. Old farms with old families who kept things. Records, equipment, seeds, varieties of things that were going away. Nora said, what are you thinking? Marie said, I'm thinking you might want to know about some of the estates that have gone through this office in the last 10 years where the property was assessed low and then cleared quickly without anyone really looking at what was there. Nora said, yes, I'd very much like to know about those. Marie said, I thought you might. I'll send you what I can that's in the public record. She did. She sent a list, 17 properties in Carroll County alone over the last decade, rural estates with low assessments that had cleared through the county system in various ways, some sold to developers, some absorbed into larger agricultural operations, some simply demolished to clear the land. Most of what they'd contained was genuinely gone, cleaned out, or destroyed. But 3 of them, Marie had flagged with a note. These ones, I don't know for certain, but I think there might be records. Family members who might know where things went. It's worth asking. Nora added it to the list. The list was long now. It was the longest it had ever been, and it was going to get longer. She understood that and was not overwhelmed by it, which she recognized as one of the specific gifts of the year. She had learned that a long list of necessary things was not a problem. It was evidence of scope. It meant the work was real. She drove to Carroll County on the last day of the year. Alone, early in the morning, before her mother arrived for the New Year's dinner she'd been planning for 2 weeks with the focused energy she brought to all meals that mattered. Before Maya and Caleb were awake in their separate rooms in the Nashville house. Before any of the things of the coming year had arrived. She drove down in the winter dark, the check engine lights still on, and she thought about getting the car looked at properly, which she could do now, which was one of the quiet specific pleasures of the changed year, that she could think about fixing the car without the thought hitting the wall of the impossible. She arrived at the property in the early gray light of a Tennessee December morning. The trees were bare. The grass was brown and frost-stiffened. The cedars along the back boundary held their color, dark and certain against the pale sky. She unlocked the shed and went inside. The cedar and beeswax smell. The ledger on its hook. The shelves that were no longer empty, because the foundation had begun filling them with the new collections. The documented donations from the Beekeeper's Glen had introduced the first round of materials from Helen Marsh, the seed samples and records now properly housed in the root cellar below. She stood in the middle of the shed and looked at everything around her. She thought about Nora Whitfield sitting on a kitchen floor in Kentucky with $43, counting the worst morning of her life, not yet knowing that the worst morning had a door in it. She thought about the door, the Padlock shed in Carroll County, the ledger, the cedar boards, and the bundles below. The root cellar and the tin boxes and 118 acres held free and clear by a man who had understood, 40 years before anyone else in his field did, that the record was the gift. She thought about what it meant to be the person who found the right thing when you were not expecting to find anything. When you had nothing left and went looking not for treasure, but for $2,000 worth of possibility, some small margin, something to hold on to. And found, instead, a life's work waiting for someone to understand it. She lifted the ledger from its hook and held it the way you hold something that has weight beyond its physical self. Then she put it back, because it belonged here, in the place William had hung it, on the hook he'd chosen, in the shed that was now the center of something larger than a single man's quiet work. She locked the shed, stood in the December morning with her breath coming out in small clouds, looking at the silver-gray wood and the tin roof and the 2 cloudy windows. William had said, "The record is the gift. The thing itself perishes. The record is what persists." She understood that now as something more than a statement about honey or documentation. She understood it as a statement about the kind of life worth building. Not the accumulated things, not the liquidatable assets, not the account balances that could be cleaned out in a Thursday morning while someone was at work. The things that could not be taken away. The attention paid, the records kept, the work done carefully over years, the trust placed in the right future. That was the record. That was what persisted. She walked back to the car in the December gray, and the check engine light came on when she started the engine, faithful and amber and completely unremarkable, and she drove north toward Nashville, toward her children, toward the new year that was opening up ahead of them all. Daniel called on a Tuesday in January. She was at the kitchen table in Nashville going through foundation correspondence when the phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize, an area code she'd never seen. She almost didn't answer. She had a system now for unknown numbers. Let it go to voicemail, listen, decide. But something made her pick up. Some instinct she couldn't name. She said hello. He said her name. Just her name. The way he'd said it for 11 years, in the particular cadence that had once been familiar as her own breathing. She sat with the phone against her ear and felt the year compress and expand at the same time, the way time does when the past walks back in through a door you thought you'd closed. She said, "What do you want, Daniel?" Not a question. A statement with a question mark implied, but not offered. He said he'd seen the article. The one in the magazine, the one Sasha Torres had written, the one with the photograph of Nora standing in front of the shed in the August light. He'd seen it, and he'd read it, and he needed to talk to her. She said, "We have attorneys. You can talk to mine." He said, "That's not what I mean." He said he wasn't calling about the legal situation. He said he was calling because he'd read the article and he understood what he'd done. He used a word she hadn't expected. He said he understood the magnitude. She said, "The magnitude?" He said yes. She thought about the magnitude. She thought about the kitchen floor and the $43 and the shoebox of opened letters arranged by date. She thought about Maya's shoulders, how they'd carried something that year that 9-year-old shoulders weren't built for. She thought about Caleb asking if there was going to be a pool. She said, "Daniel, I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it clearly." He said, "Okay." She said, "You left because you thought I couldn't hold it together. You took everything you thought had value because you assumed I didn't know the difference between what was worth something and what wasn't. And you left behind the one thing that mattered because you didn't look closely enough to understand what you were looking at." He didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that because it's true and because I think you're calling expecting anger, and I don't have any for you right now. What I have is clarity. You showed me something about myself that I didn't know, that I was more capable than either of us understood, that I could pay attention to the right things under pressure, that I could ask the right questions when everything was telling me there were no good answers." She paused. Through the kitchen window, the January Nashville morning was gray and cold and entirely real. She said, "The kids are okay. They're better than okay. You don't need to worry about them, but you do need to be accountable for them. That's a conversation for the attorneys, and it's going to happen whether you want it to or not." He said, "I know." She said, "Good. Then that's all we have to say." She hung up, set the phone face down on the table, sat with the quiet of the kitchen for a while. Then she picked the phone back up and went back to the foundation correspondence, because the work was there and the work was what mattered. And she had learned this year that the best response to the things that tried to diminish you was to keep going with the thing they tried to interrupt. The attorney handled the rest. Daniel's accountability was established through proper channels, formal and documented, the way things should be when trust has been entirely spent. The legal architecture of what he'd done was addressed methodically, some of it reversible, some of it simply absorbed and moved past. The way you move past things that cannot be recovered but also cannot be allowed to define every day forward. She didn't hate him. She'd thought she would, at some point in the year, and she hadn't. What she felt was something more like the specific sadness of understanding that some people see clearly and some people don't, and that a person's inability to see clearly enough is its own kind of poverty, one that no amount of cleaned-out bank accounts could address. He had stood in front of 40 years of William Ryder's careful work and seen $1,900 and moved on. She had asked what was inside. That was the whole of it. The Ryder Foundation's first full year of operation was not the glamorous thing that the magazine article implied was coming. It was administrative and painstaking and full of the specific complications of building an institution from scratch with no template to follow, because what William had built was genuinely unusual, and the framework for continuing it was something that had to be invented as it went. Dr. Webb became the Foundation's first formal academic partner, his arrangement with Vanderbilt structured to allow him to dedicate a third of his time to the Foundation's documentation work. He was rigorous and specific and occasionally difficult to work with in the way that people who know a great deal about a subject are sometimes difficult, but Nora had learned this year that difficult and trustworthy were not the same category, and he was absolutely trustworthy about the work. She hired 2 people in the first quarter. A collections manager named David Park, who'd spent 8 years at a museum in Memphis cataloging agricultural artifacts, and who understood both the physical care of objects and the digital systems needed to make records accessible, and an outreach coordinator named Tamsin Okafor, who was 28 years old and had a master's degree in rural community development, and who had called Nora after reading the article and said, "I've been looking for something like this for 3 years. Please let me be part of it." Tamsin was the one who built the network. She drove county roads in rural Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Alabama through the first half of the year, following the leads from Marie at the Carroll County Assessor's office and from the letters that kept arriving after the article. She sat in kitchens and barns and old farmhouses and talked to people who had been keeping things, old farmers with seed stocks and variety documentation, elderly women with generations of canning records that constituted an accidental archive of regional food history, retired agricultural extension agents with files going back to the 1960s. She called Nora from these trips with the urgency of someone who had found a water source in a drought. She said, "Nora, there is so much out there. So much that nobody has asked about. These people, they're relieved. They've been holding on to things and not knowing who to call. And when I show up, they look at me like I got there just in time." Nora said, "You probably did. For some of them." That was the part that stayed with her through the year. The timing of it. William had built his collection across 40 years, which meant he'd started it in 1981, and the things he'd been collecting had been disappearing across precisely those decades. The commercial agriculture transformation of the 1970s and 1980s had standardized and consolidated in ways that eliminated hundreds of local varieties and practices, and the documentation of what was lost had in most cases not been done at all, or had been done by individuals working alone who had no way of connecting their records to anything larger. William had been one of those individuals. He'd worked alone, by necessity and maybe by temperament. But he'd understood that the record itself, assembled and documented and kept accessible, was the thing that could accumulate into something that mattered beyond any one person's work. The foundation was making that possible. Not spectacularly, not immediately, but steadily, the way William had done everything, one labeled jar at a time. Glenn became the foundation's unofficial ambassador to the Carroll County beekeeping community. He organized a gathering in March at the foundation's new meeting building on the property. 8 beekeepers and their families, people who had been keeping heritage strains in isolation and who sat around a table for the first time talking to each other about the work they'd been doing alone. Nora sat at the edge of that conversation and listened. One of the beekeepers was 73 years old and had been keeping the same colony lineage for 41 years, a strain his father had started that exhibited characteristics his family had always valued and that no commercial operation had ever documented. He'd never talked about it publicly because it had never occurred to him that anyone would be interested. He talked about it that afternoon for 2 hours. Dr. Webb took notes. David Park set up his recording equipment. And the man talked about his bees with the specific love of someone who has spent a very long time paying close attention to something. And the room was entirely still, the way rooms go still when something true and important is being said. After the gathering, Glenn walked with Nora around the property in the March air, the land starting to green at the edges, the cedars steady as they always were. He said, "William would have wanted to be at that table." She said he was. In every way that mattered. Glenn looked at the shed. Said, "You've done right by him." She said, "I'm continuing what he started." That's different from doing right by him. Doing right by him would have been doing it sooner. Understanding sooner. Glenn said, "Nobody understood sooner. That's the whole point. He was ahead of the understanding." She said, "I know. But I wish he'd had someone to talk to. Someone at that table." Glenn was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Maybe that's why he left it to you. Not just because you'd continue it. Because you'd make sure nobody doing this kind of work had to do it alone." She thought about that for a long time after. The spring brought 2 things she hadn't expected. The first was a visit from a representative of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. A woman named Dr. Claire Hodges, who was the museum's curator of agricultural heritage and who had read the article and followed the foundation's first months of work, and who drove down to Carroll County on a morning in April and walked through the shed and the root cellar and the meeting building and the fields with the focused attention of someone assessing something for fit. She sat with Nora afterward in the meeting building and said, "What you're building here is genuinely significant. Not just as a local heritage project. As a model." Nora said, "A model for what?" Dr. Hodges said, "For distributed documentation of pre-industrial agricultural heritage. The Smithsonian has been trying to address this problem for 15 years. The challenge has always been that the knowledge and the materials are dispersed, held by individuals in rural communities who don't have access to institutional frameworks. You found a way to bring the institutional framework to them instead of requiring them to come to it. That's not a small thing." She said, "William figured that out. I just continued it." Dr. Hodges said, "He figured out the approach. You built the institution. Both matter." The Smithsonian conversation continued through the spring and summer. It was complicated and slow and involved lawyers and board structures and questions of intellectual property and archival access that required Patricia Osei's attention on a regular basis. But it was also real, and it was moving in a direction that would give the foundation's work a reach and a permanence that no privately funded operation could achieve alone. The second unexpected thing was simpler and more personal. A woman named Ruth Beale, who was 64 years old and lived in Henderson County, one of the counties where William had held land, reached out through the foundation's website contact form in April. She'd read the article, and she had a question she said she was almost embarrassed to ask. Nora called her back directly. Ruth said, "I knew William Ryder. Not well, but I knew him. We were neighbors, of a kind, when I was young. He used to come to my father's farm to look at the bees my father kept. He was very quiet. He paid attention to things." Nora said, "Yes, that's exactly right." Ruth said, "I've been wondering. In the article it said he left everything to a great niece he'd never met. And I've been wondering whether he was lonely, whether he chose to be alone, or whether it was just how it ended up." Nora sat with that for a moment. It was the same question Maya had asked in different words. She said, "I've been wondering the same thing. I've come to think he chose the work and the aloneness came with it. But I also think, reading his ledger, that he was at peace with it in a way that suggests it wasn't a source of suffering. He had the bees. He had the work. He had the certainty that what he was doing mattered even when no one else could see it." Ruth said, "That sounds right. He had a particular kind of contentment. Serious, but not sad." Nora said, "That's a very precise description." Ruth laughed a little. She said, "I've thought about him a lot over the years. He was the kind of person who makes an impression without trying to. You'd think about him afterward, about the way he paid attention to things." She asked if she could visit the foundation, see the shed, see where he'd kept everything. Nora said, "Please come." Ruth came in May, on a morning when the Carroll County land was in its fullest spring green, the oaks and maples all the way out, the grass thick in the cleared spaces, the cedars along the back boundary as dark and steady as they'd been in every season Nora had seen them in now. She walked Ruth through the shed slowly, showed her the ledger still on its hook, the shelves now partly refilled with incoming collection materials, the cedar boards set back in the floor above the now cataloged and properly stored contents of the space below. Ruth touched the ledger with one hand, lightly, the way you touch something that carries more than its physical weight. She said, "He really documented everything." Nora said, "Everything. Dates, weights, sources, bloom conditions, everything. 40 years of records." Ruth said, "That's what he was like. When he was at my father's farm, he'd write things down while he watched the bees. Little notes. My father used to say William was the only person he'd ever met who was more interested in understanding something than in having it." Nora looked at the ledger on its hook. She said, "That might be the best description of him I've heard." Ruth stayed for lunch. They ate at the table in the meeting building with Glenn and David Park and Tamsin, who had driven up from a field visit in Mississippi, and the conversation moved between William and the foundation's work and the Henderson County property, which was 31 acres of good land that Ruth said she'd always wondered about, always noticed from the county road without knowing who it belonged to. Nora said, "It belongs to the foundation now. We're planning to use it as a demonstration site. Heritage crops, documentation in progress, a space where agricultural researchers can come and work with materials that have been properly preserved." Ruth said, "William would have liked that more than anything." Nora said, "I think so." After Ruth left, Glenn walked with Nora to the fence line in the afternoon light. He said, "She's right. About what he would have liked." Nora said, "I know." He said, "Do you understand yet what he actually left you?" She said, "I think so." "Tell me what you mean." He said, "He left you the work. Not just the materials and the land and the money. The work itself. The direction of it. The understanding of what needed doing and why. He couldn't continue it himself. So he structured everything in a way that made it possible for someone else to continue it, and he trusted the right person to show up." She said, "And you think I'm the right person?" He said, "You showed up and asked what was inside. That's all the right person ever has to do." She looked at the shed in the afternoon light. The silver-gray wood and the tin roof and the two windows that were no longer cloudy, cleaned properly now as part of the restoration, letting in the light. She thought about showing up and asking. She thought about what it cost to ask, when everything was. Telling you there was nothing worth finding. When the county assessor had said $1,900 and her husband had said worthless, and the world had arranged itself that year into the posture of someone explaining why there was nothing left for her. She had asked anyway. She had opened the door and gone inside and stood in the cedar and beeswax smell and photographed the ledger pages at 1 in the morning because something in her recognized that this was worth the attention even before she understood why. That recognition, she thought, was the inheritance William had been counting on. Not the specific knowledge of heritage honey or agricultural documentation or the market for pre-industrial American food varietals. The disposition, the willingness to look closely at what everyone else had walked past. The belief, instinctive and not yet articulate, that overlooked things were not always without value. He'd trusted that quality to exist in whoever came. And it had. The summer was full. The foundation's work expanded in ways that kept requiring new organizational structures, new systems, new conversations with people who had expertise Nora didn't have and who were, each of them, drawn to the work for the same reason she was. They understood that the record mattered, that keeping track of what was going away was serious work, that someone had to do it. She was learning, slowly and sometimes in the specific way that mistakes teach things, how to lead an institution without losing the quality that had made her find it in the first place. The attention, the willingness to ask what was inside. It was tempting, she found, to let the institution become about its own operation. The grant applications, the board governance, the Smithsonian partnership negotiations, the tax filings, the personnel questions. These were all real and necessary and consumed significant portions of every week. And they were also, if she wasn't careful, the kind of thing that could replace the core of the work with its administrative container. She guarded against this deliberately. She drove to Carroll County herself at least once a month, alone usually, and spent an afternoon in the shed or the root cellar or walking the land. She went on field visits with Tamsin twice a quarter, sitting in the same kitchens and barns, listening to the same kind of conversation William had conducted alone for 40 years. She read the ledger, not always with purpose, sometimes just to remember what careful attention sounded like written down. Maya came with her to Carroll County in July, as Nora had promised. They drove down on a Saturday morning, the two of them, Maya reading in the passenger seat with her feet on the dashboard, which Nora had given up telling her not to do. She showed Maya the shed, the ledger, the root cellar, the restored cedar boards in the floor. She showed her the meeting building and the records that had come in from the beekeepers and from Helen Marsh and from the others Tamsin had found. She walked the land with her, all of it, the cleared areas and the stand of cedars and the back boundary where the root cellar door was set into the slope. Maya was quiet through most of it in the way she was quiet when she was absorbing rather than processing, taking everything in before deciding what to say. At the end, standing at the fence line in the July heat with the land behind them, she said, "It's bigger than I thought." Nora said, "It keeps getting bigger. That's what happens when you start looking at something carefully. You find more to look at." Maya said, "Do you think we'll run out of things to find?" Nora said, "No. The world has been losing its memory for a long time. There's a lot of it to recover." Maya said, "So the work doesn't end." Nora said, "The work doesn't end. But that's not a bad thing. That means there will always be something to do that matters." Maya looked out at the land, at the shed with its tin roof and the cedars beyond, at the sky above Carroll County, Tennessee, blue and deep in the July afternoon. She said, "I want to learn about the bees." Nora said, "I'll introduce you to Glenn." She did. That afternoon, Glenn sat with Maya for an hour at the fence line and talked about bees the way he'd always talked about them, patiently and specifically, answering every question Maya asked with the full attention of someone who understood that curiosity was worth taking seriously. Maya asked about the heritage strains, about why certain characteristics were preserved and others weren't, about how you documented the behavior of a colony over time, about whether the bees knew they were the last of their kind. Glenn said, "That last one is a poet's question." Maya said, "I'm not a poet." Glenn said, "Not yet." She laughed, the real laugh that had come back this year, the one that had been absent for too much of the one before. Nora stood at the edge of the conversation and listened to her daughter talk to an old beekeeper about heritage strains in the July heat of Carroll County, Tennessee, and felt something she had no adequate word for. Something in the range of gratitude, but larger and more specific. Something that included William and the ledger and the padlock door and the cedar boards and $43 on a kitchen floor and every single step of the year that had led to this afternoon. She let herself feel it fully. She was learning to do that. To let the good things have the same weight, she'd always given the hard ones. In August, the Smithsonian partnership was formalized. The agreement gave the foundation access to the museum's conservation and research infrastructure while maintaining the foundation's independence and its grounding in Carroll County. The terms were the result of 6 months of careful negotiation, and they were good terms. Terms that protected what William had built without subordinating it to institutional priorities that didn't belong to it. Dr. Hodges came to the signing ceremony. She walked through the shed one more time before the paperwork and stood in the cedar and beeswax smell for a while without saying anything. She said afterward, "To Nora, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never seen a private collection with this level of documentation. He was extraordinary." Nora said, "He was. He just didn't have anywhere to put it." Dr. Hodges said, "Now he does." The fall brought the first annual gathering of the people Tamsin had been finding across the year. 12 individuals and families, from Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, and upstate New York. People who had been keeping heritage varieties and old farm records in isolation, doing William's work without knowing anyone else was doing it, without a framework to connect to. They came to Carroll County on a weekend in October when the hills were in full color, the land in its most beautiful season, the oaks and maples doing what they did. They came with their materials and their records and their histories, and they sat around the table in the meeting building for 2 days and talked. Nora opened the gathering. She said, "William Ryder kept bees in this county for 40 years. He understood something most people didn't understand, that the documentation of disappearing things was its own form of preservation, maybe the most important form, because the physical thing perishes but the record persists. He kept that record alone, in a locked shed on 2 acres of land, and he left it behind for someone to find and continue. You're here because you've been doing the same work, in your own fields and your own barns and your own kitchens, and we'd like this to be the place where that work connects, where the record grows beyond any one person's keeping." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the upstate New York woman, Helen Marsh, who had driven herself down again at 81 years old, said, "I should have found this place 30 years ago." And the room laughed, and the conversation began. She listened to it all weekend. To the 73-year-old beekeeper and Helen with her buckwheat and a man from Mississippi who'd kept a strain of muscadine grape his family had cultivated since Reconstruction and who had never been asked to talk about it formally before, and who talked about it for an hour with a specificity and love that made Dr. Webb's note-taking go faster and faster. To a woman from Alabama who'd been keeping a variety of field pea her grandmother had grown and who had 3 generations of canning records that constituted an accidental account of a rural Southern family's relationship to their land across 100 years. Each of them had come not knowing quite what they'd find. Each of them left with something they hadn't had before. Not just the institutional connection, not just the knowledge that the foundation would help preserve their records. Something simpler and more fundamental. The knowledge that the work they'd been doing alone was part of something larger. That the attention they'd been paying, year after year, to things everyone else had stopped noticing, was not eccentric or marginal or merely sentimental. That it was necessary. That it mattered. That was William's real gift, Nora understood, standing at the edge of the room on the second day, while conversations ran on past the scheduled end. Not the honey, not the land, not the money that had made the foundation possible. The understanding that overlooked things were worth the attention, that the record was the gift, that keeping track of what was going away was serious work, the most serious kind, because once it was gone, and no amount of subsequent attention could recover what had not been kept. He'd known that in 1981 when he sealed the first jar. She knew it now. She walked out of the meeting building in the October afternoon and stood on the Carroll County land in the fall light. The oaks burning orange and gold. The cedars dark and constant. The shed with its tin roof and its restored windows and the ledger still on its hook inside. She thought about the year. Not from the kitchen floor forward, the way she'd been thinking about it for most of the months since. She thought about it from here backward. From this afternoon, from this land, from this gathering in this building on this October day, back through the foundation's first year and the auction in Nashville and the summer of authentication and the winter of discovery, back through the county motel and the November drive, with Caleb asleep in the booster seat, back through the $43 and the kitchen floor and the foreclosure notice on the door. From here, From this direction, the year looked different. It looked like a path. Not an obvious one. Not a path anyone would have looked at in November and called promising, but a path nonetheless. Each step having been possible only because of the step before it. The hardest things having made the best things possible. The lowest morning having been, in ways she could only see clearly from this distance, the beginning. She didn't believe in that kind of narrative usually. She was too practical for it, too attentive to the role of accident and luck and the way things could have gone differently at any point. She knew that another person, in the same circumstances, might have seen the county assessment and not driven down, might have taken Preston Hale's offer, might have sold the land the moment the auction proceeds cleared and not thought twice about the root cellar or the tin boxes or the heritage varieties going undocumented in rural counties across the South. Another person might have looked at a padlock shed on 2 acres of November land and seen $1,900 and moved on. She had asked what was inside. That was the path, not fate, not design, not the reward for some quality she'd always had that deserved recognition. Just the decision, in a specific moment, to ask instead of assume, to look instead of walk past, to open the door. Glenn appeared beside her. He had a talent for being present at the right moment that she'd stopped being surprised by and had started simply appreciating. He said, "Good gathering." She said, "Very good." He said, William would have sat in the back and listened to every word and not said much. She said, like he was taking notes. Glenn said, "Always taking notes." She said, "Glenn, can I ask you something?" He said, "Go ahead." She said, "Do you think he knew?" When he set it all up the way he did, the ledger and the storage and the properties held free and clear and the automated taxes and the licensing. Do you think he knew what he was building toward, or was he just doing the next careful thing? Glenn was quiet for a while, long enough that a crow moved through the oak canopy above them, and the sound of it passed, and the afternoon settled back to stillness. He said, "I think he knew the direction. He knew what was going away, and he knew someone needed to keep the record, and he knew he wouldn't live to see it all the way through. I think the rest of it, the specifics of who would find it and what they'd do with it, I think he trusted that to the thing itself, to the work having enough integrity that the right person would recognize it." She said, "That took a lot of faith." Glenn said, "He was a patient man." She said, "Yes, he was." She looked at the shed one more time. The silver-gray wood, the tin roof catching the last of the afternoon light. The 2 windows clean now, the interior visible in the low sun, the shelves and the ledger and the beginning of something. She said, "Thank you for watching this place, for filing those objections, for being here every time I came down." Glenn said, "William saved my father's colony line in 1987, came in when the hive was failing, identified the problem, helped him save the queen. Father kept that line for 20 more years. It's one of the strains we documented this spring." She hadn't known that. She said, "You never told me." He said, "You didn't need to know it to do the right thing. I didn't want it to feel like a debt." She said, "It doesn't. It feels like a thread." He nodded, said, "That's what all of this is. Threads. William to your father's colony. William to you. You to all of them in there. Long threads, hard to see until you follow them back. But real." She said, "Real." She drove back to Nashville as the October dark came down over the Tennessee hills, the trees in their last brilliant color before the leaves let go, and she thought about long threads and the way they connected things that looked, from any single point, entirely unrelated. A man who kept bees alone in Carroll County, and a woman who sat on a kitchen floor in Kentucky, and a 9-year-old who learned about heritage strains from an old beekeeper at a fence line, and an 81-year-old woman who drove herself to Tennessee with 3 boxes of farm records because someone had finally asked. All of it connected. All of it part of the same thread, going back further than she could trace and forward further than she could see. The work was the thread. The keeping was the gift. The record was what persisted. She knew that now the way you know things that have been demonstrated rather than just stated. Through the specific weight of a ledger in your hands, and a number on an auction screen, and a daughter asking, "Can I learn about the bees?" and an old man saying you showed up and asked what was inside, and that's all the right person ever has to do. She drove north through the October dark, the check engine light amber on the dashboard, finally scheduled to be looked at next week. The Nashville house waiting, Maya and Caleb and her mother, and the correspondence, and the next list of necessary things, and the work that didn't end, because the world kept needing it. She thought about William Ryder locking the shed door for the last time, setting the padlock, walking to his truck in whatever season it had been, driving away from the land he'd kept for 40 years and trusting it to the right future. She thought about what it took to trust the right future when you wouldn't be there to see it. She thought about herself driving north on a November road a year ago with $43 and a check engine light, and 2 kids, and nothing that looked like a path forward, trusting anyway, asking anyway, opening the door. The thread was long. She was somewhere in the middle of it. The work she was doing now would be handed to someone else eventually, the way William had handed it, and that person would hand it further, and the record would grow, and the things that had been going away would have proof of their existence in the place where William Ryder had started keeping track of them in 1981, in a shed on 2 acres in Carroll County, Tennessee, because he understood that the record was the gift. She took the Nashville exit. The lights of the city came up ahead of her, familiar now, home. She thought, overlooked things. She thought, ask what is inside. She thought, the record persists. She thought about all the doors in the world that were padlocked and waiting, full of what someone had spent a life carefully keeping, trusting the right person to come along and ask. She thought about how many right people were out there, driving toward those doors without knowing it yet, thinking they had nothing, thinking the year was only what it appeared to be on the surface, thinking the worth was elsewhere. It never was. The worth was always there, in the thing everyone had looked at and called worthless because they hadn't asked what was inside. She had asked, and William Ryder, 40 years ago, in the particular patience of a man who understood things before his time, had made sure the answer was worth finding. There was one more thing that happened that year that she hadn't planned for and couldn't have anticipated, which was, she'd come to understand how the best things arrived. In November, almost exactly 1 year from the day she'd first driven to Carroll County, she received a call from Howard Briggs in Huntington, the local attorney who'd managed William's affairs and who'd been trying to find her for months before Patricia located him. Howard called periodically with small administrative matters, the kind of residual business that trailed behind any estate for years, and she'd come to think of his calls as the last threads of William's practical life, being tied off one at a time. But this call was different. He said, I found something in my office that I should have given you sooner. I apologize for the delay. When I'm managing an estate, I sometimes receive things through informal channels that I set aside pending formal proceedings, and I should have passed this to you months ago. He said he'd received, about 3 months after William's death, a sealed envelope from an attorney in a city she hadn't expected. The envelope had been sent via the legal process for forwarding estate correspondence, addressed to Howard for delivery to William's heir. Howard had set it aside in the ordinary course of his work and had found it again only now while reorganizing his files. He said, it's a letter. Personal. Not legal in nature, from what I can tell from the exterior. I don't know the sender except by the return address. He read the return address. She wrote it down. She called the sender the next morning. It took 2 tries before someone answered. The woman on the other end was in her late 70s. Her name was Frances Webb, and she had, she said, been a neighbor of William's in the early years, before he settled permanently in Carroll County, before the bees were everything. She said, we were friends for a few years when we were young. He was one of the most attentive people I've ever known. He paid attention to me the way he paid attention to everything, like I was worth understanding. Nora said, I believe that. Frances said, we lost touch when he moved. That was common then. People moved and the connection faded and you thought about them sometimes, but the world didn't give you the tools it gives people now for finding each other again. I thought about William for 50 years. I wrote to him once, maybe 25 years ago, and the letter came back undeliverable. I thought he might have died. Nora said, he didn't die until 2 years ago. Frances said, I know. I saw an obituary. A small one, very brief. It said no immediate family. I wrote the letter to his estate attorney because I didn't know what else to do. I wanted someone to know that he'd mattered, that someone had known him when he was young and thought about him across all those years. Nora held the phone. Outside, the Nashville November was cold and gray and entirely itself. She said, Mrs. Webb, can I read you something? Frances said, please. Nora walked to the folder on the shelf where she kept William's papers, the copies she'd made of everything, and she opened it to the last ledger entry. She read it aloud, slowly, the way it deserved to be read. The record is the gift. The thing itself perishes. The record is what persists. Whoever finds this, understand that the work is in the keeping, not the having. The keeping. Silence on the other end. Then Francis said, "That's him. That's exactly him." Nora said, "He built something extraordinary. He spent 40 years building it. And he left it to me, someone he'd never met, and I've been continuing it. The work is real and growing, and it's going to last." Francis said, "He was always going to do something like that. You could tell even when he was young that he was building towards something. I just didn't know what." She said, "Now you do." Francis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you. I didn't know I needed to hear that, but I did." After they hung up, Nora sat at the kitchen table for a while. She thought about William at 20-something, attentive and serious, paying attention to a woman who remembered him for 50 years. She thought about the way attention worked, how it transferred itself, how the person who was truly seen by another person carried that experience for the rest of their lives. Francis had been seen by William and thought about him for 50 years. The beekeepers whose colonies he'd helped had filed county objections on his behalf after his death. Glenn had watched the property for 2 years. Ruth Beale had driven to Carroll County just to stand in the shed and feel the reality of someone she'd known briefly but truly. William had been alone. He'd been physically alone for most of his adult life, in the way that certain kinds of deep work required. But he had not been without impact. He had not passed through the world without touching it. The attention he'd paid to things and to people had accumulated the way his honey had accumulated, quietly and across years, into something with a weight and a value that was only visible when you stood back far enough to see the whole shape of it. She thought about the loneliness question, the one Maya had asked and Ruth Beale had asked and Francis Webb had implied. She'd said he was at peace with it. She still believed that. But she understood now that peace and aloneness were not the same as invisibility. William had been seen, not by crowds, not by institutions, not by the people who would eventually understand what he'd built, but by Francis, who thought about him for 50 years, by Glenn, who watched his property, by Howard Briggs, who managed his affairs with loyalty and care. He had been seen by the right people. That was its own form of wealth, she thought, the kind that didn't appear on a county assessment, the kind that outlasted the person who'd accumulated it, the kind that arrived in sealed envelopes through estate attorneys a year after someone was gone, because the impression had been too real to let expire. She added Francis Webb's letter to William's papers folder, set it alongside the ledger copies and the deed photographs and the authentication reports and the mission statement of the Ryder Foundation printed on the foundation letterhead that David Park had designed, clean and simple, with the name in plain letters and below it, in William's handwriting reproduced from the ledger, "The record is the gift." She looked at the folder for a while. Then she closed it and set it back on the shelf and went back to the work. The work that December was the planning document for the foundation's second year. A scope that was larger than the first year's, because the first year had demonstrated that the need was larger than they'd estimated and the response had been larger than they'd expected. Tamsin had mapped 43 individuals and families across 7 states who were keeping heritage agricultural materials in isolation and who had expressed interest in working with the foundation. 43. And those were only the ones Tamsin had reached personally. The article had generated letters from a dozen more who hadn't been visited yet. The Smithsonian Partnership was going to help with the institutional infrastructure for cataloging at scale. Dr. Webb's Vanderbilt connection was building toward a formal research program that would use the foundation's collection as a living archive. A grant application had gone to an agricultural heritage fund that Patricia said had a strong likelihood of success based on the foundation's first-year results. It was growing. It was going to keep growing. And Nora was learning, month by month, what it meant to lead something that was larger than any single person's attention could hold, which was that you built systems and you hired people who cared and you trusted the work to be what it was, which was worth doing, which made it worth trusting. She thought about what Patricia had said the day she'd told her about the Carroll County root cellar discovery, back in May, back when the shape of the estate was still revealing itself piece by piece. Patricia had said, "This is what intentional legacy looks like. When someone has thought carefully about what they're leaving and why, and structured it for durability." William had structured for durability. The properties held free and clear. The taxes automated. The collection documented. The licensing income accumulated. The ledger legible to whoever came with the right eyes. She was building for durability too. The foundation structure was designed to outlast any single leader, to hold the work regardless of who was doing it. That was the only way to honor what William had started. Not by keeping it close, not by making herself essential to it, but by making the institution strong enough to continue without her if it had to. By trusting the work itself. The record is the gift. The thing itself perishes. The record is what persists. She understood now that this applied to her too. To the foundation. To whatever she built in the years ahead. The institution itself was a record, an organized form of the attention William had been paying alone for 40 years, made legible and accessible and durable in ways a single person's locked shed could never quite be. The institution was the next form of the keeping. She drove to Carroll County one last time before the year ended. December again, the land in its winter stillness, the oaks bare and the grass brown silver and the cedars dark against the gray sky. The same landscape she'd first seen 14 months ago, driving in on a November day with everything behind her and nothing visible ahead. She stood in front of the shed and let herself be in it for a while. Not thinking, not planning, not making lists. Just standing in the December cold with the smell of cedar and beeswax reaching her even from outside, because 40 years of tending had saturated the wood that thoroughly, because some things went that deep. She thought about the first time. The padlock and the key and the door swinging inward and the smell hitting her like recognition, like something she'd known before she knew it. The shelves and the ledger and the cedar boards and the bundles below. The motel room and the phone screen and the numbers that kept not adding up to what the county had said. She thought about sitting on the motel bed at 1 in the morning with the ledger photos open on her phone, reading William's handwriting in the particular quiet of a room where her children were asleep and the world outside had narrowed to the specific question of what this shed contained. She'd asked that question without knowing what the answer would be, without any particular confidence that there was a good answer. She'd asked because not asking felt worse, because the alternative was to drive home and let the shed stay locked and never find out. She'd found out. She unlocked the shed now and went inside. The ledger on its hook, the shelves with their growing contents, the cedar and beeswax smell, the cedar boards set flush in the floor, no longer concealing anything, the root cellar below them properly organized and documented and accessible. She lifted the ledger from its hook, held it. Read the last entry one more time. The record is the gift. The thing itself perishes. The record is what persists. Whoever finds this, understand that the work is in the keeping, not the having. The keeping. She put the ledger back. She stood in the shed for a moment longer, in the December stillness, in the smell of 40 years of careful work. Then she went back outside and locked the door and walked to her car and drove north, toward Nashville, toward the work that was waiting, toward her children and her mother and everything the year had made possible by being first what it had been. The check engine light came on when she started the engine. She'd had the car looked at twice now. The mechanic said it was a sensor, probably fine, might come on forever, nothing to worry about. She didn't worry about it. She drove north through the December. Tennessee hills, the bare trees and the gray sky and the road she knew well now. The turns familiar, the distance manageable, the destination clear. She thought about William, and she thought about Francis, and she thought about Glenn, and she thought about Maya learning about bees from an old man at a fence line, and she thought about Helen Marsh driving herself across 4 states at 81 years old because someone had asked. She thought about the gathering in October and all the threads in that room, long and thin and going back decades, connecting things that looked unrelated from any single vantage point, but were, followed carefully, all part of the same work. The work of keeping track, the work of asking what was inside, the work of trusting that overlooked things had value and that the record of them was worth more than the things themselves, and that someone had to do the keeping or the loss was permanent. Someone had to do the keeping. She was doing it. Tamsin was doing it. David and Dr. Webb and Glenn and the beekeepers and Helen and the man from Mississippi with his muscadine grape strain and all the others Tamsin was still finding, still calling, still sitting across from in kitchens and barns and saying, "We'd like to know about what you've been keeping." The thread was long, and it was real, and she was somewhere in the middle of it, and the middle was exactly the right place to be. She drove north. The December dark came down over the hills. The Nashville lights appeared on the horizon ahead of her, warm and specific and home. She thought, ask what is inside. She thought, the record persists. She thought, the worth was always there. It always was. It only needed someone willing to look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.